It was in July 1943 that the Russian city of Kursk bore witness to the largest tank battle in history. The outcome of the battle was crucial. It put an end to Hitler's offensive power on the Eastern Front. At Kursk, the Soviet army would draw the German forces into a deliberate battle of attrition designed to grind down Hitler's last remaining attacking strength in the east. The German staff officers could see the danger, but the Führer was blind to it. On the 10th of May 1943, the architect of Germany's tank forces, General Heinz Guderian, became engaged in a heated conversation with Adolf Hitler regarding Hitler's decision to attack at Kursk. Guderian is reported to have asked, "How many people do you think even know where Kursk is? It is a matter of profound indifference to the world whether we hold Kursk or not. Why do we want to attack in the east at all this year?" To this, Hitler replied, "You're quite right. Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over." Guderian strongly advised Hitler to remain on the defensive, but Hitler was determined. He would go ahead with the attack. Guderian was not alone in his apprehension. Almost to a man, Hitler's generals had advised him to adopt a defensive posture on the Eastern Front during 1943. The last 2 years had cost them dearly, and they needed a chance to rest and regroup. Hitler's decision to attack would seriously damage his forces and remove any hope the Germans had of regaining the initiative in the Eastern Theatre. By draining away the German tank strength, the short but intensive Battle of Kursk would tip the scales of World War II decisively in the favor of Soviet Russia. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler's forces smashed through the Polish frontier. This prompted Britain and France to officially declare war on Germany 2 days later. Hitler hoped to avoid this outcome, as he never expected the Western governments to go to war over Poland. Poland was obliterated in a matter of weeks when Hitler used the blitzkrieg tactic to gain control of the country. Before Hitler could continue advancing eastwards, he knew he would first have to deal with his enemies in the west. By May 1940, the German troops turned their offensive westwards. The war with the West was drastically different to that with Poland, as the forces facing the Germans were modern and well equipped. However, the British and French armies were still relying on tactics used during the First World War, and were totally unprepared for the superior skills and strategy of the Germans. Within weeks, Hitler took control of Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The British managed to escape across the Channel at Dunkirk, but were in no position to fight back. Full of confidence after the great victories of 1939 and 1940, Hitler pushed ahead with his plans to invade Soviet Russia in 1941. He held a deep contempt for the Soviet Union and boasted that we just have to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down. The gains made during the invasion of Russia in June 1941 confirmed Hitler's optimism, as a disorganized and poorly led Red Army retreated in complete confusion. However, the first winter in Russia gave the German soldiers a sharp taste of what lay in store for them. Battered but unbowed, the German forces just managed to avoid total collapse. For the next 18 months, the front lines seesawed back and forth, as both sides wrestled for control of the towns and cities. The southern region in particular saw some of the biggest and most damaging battles for both sides. Ferocious battles for Sevastopol, Kiev, Rostov, and Stalingrad consumed vast amounts of men and materials, as control of the towns and cities swayed from side to side. In February 1943, the total defeat at Stalingrad was a disaster for the Germans. But a switch to the strategic defensive might just have brought enough time to regain the initiative in 1944. But Hitler was adamant. He would attack. By mid-1943, the focus of attention would once more be in the south of Russia, where the Germans were to make one more attempt to gain the decisive edge. This was to be the last great gamble in the East, a high noon for Hitler and his hopes for victory. Confident after the stunning victories over Poland in 1939 and the Western Allies in 1940, Hitler pushed ahead with his ultimate goal of defeating Soviet Russia in 1941. His generals had advised him to wait, for German forces were not strong enough at this stage of the war. They needed more time to prepare. Hitler instead mounted the biggest land invasion in history. Like his previous campaigns, Hitler expected quick victory, and the mobile warfare tactic was employed once again. By the winter of 1941, however, it was apparent that the war in Russia would be difficult and take far longer than anticipated. The Russians launched a massive counteroffensive during this first winter and almost succeeded in defeating the Germans. Hitler himself issued the order to stand fast and hold the ground already won. The success of this policy convinced Hitler that he knew better than his generals. But when it was repeated, the policy of holding on was to prove disastrous. The crushing defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad affected Hitler deeply, as it came as a direct result of his refusal to allow a withdrawal. Now he planned the Kursk offensive to regain the initiative and save his reputation. Unlike Hitler, the ruthless dictator of the USSR had no formal military experience. A politician first and foremost, he was prepared to do almost anything to maintain his position of power. Stalin was responsible for the purges of the Red Army in 1937, which severely hampered their fighting capabilities in the early stages of the German invasion. The loss of so many commanders prevented the Red Army from fighting cohesively. Nevertheless, Stalin knew how to manipulate people and situations to his own advantage. Once the German invasion began, he quickly rallied the population behind him, despite the fact that he had been systematically killing countless numbers of his own people. He played on their love of Mother Russia, and even within the army, he ensured that the power of the political commissars was limited during these crucial early stages. He was astute enough, however, to listen to his generals and took their advice many times. He put the brilliance of commanders like Zhukov and Konev to good use, playing one against the other to ensure maximum results. Quick to take the glory for any successes, and ruthless enough to ensure his troops and people would not dare to question him, he saw his nation through to ultimate victory over the Nazi invaders. By the spring of 1943, the German army and German nation were still in deep shock over the defeat at Stalingrad. This defeat was their first major reverse of the war, and the famed tenacity of the Russian soldier had been decisively proved. The Russian offensive, launched immediately after Stalingrad, presented the very real danger that the German army would be pushed back even further. Fast reactions from von Manstein and the effective use of the fighting capabilities of the German armed forces finally halted the Russian attack. The stunning victory at Kharkov, achieved against the odds, became known as von Manstein's miracle. The desperate men of Army Group South had at last contained the Soviet advance. Further north, Army Group Center had held fast and halted the Russian advances near Orel. In between these two areas, the Soviet advances had created a huge enemy bulge, which held large amounts of Soviet men and materials. In the middle of the bulge lay the town of Kursk. Keen to capitalize on the victory at Kharkov, Hitler wanted to regain the initiative in the east. Von Manstein drew up a plan that provided for a similar action to Kharkov, where the German army had first given up ground and had then quickly counterattacked when the Russian lines of supply became overstretched. Characteristically, Hitler rejected the withdrawal phase of the plan, but approved the attacks towards Kursk. This part of the plan was developed by Colonel General Zeitzler, who gave it the final draft, codenamed Citadel. The plan was to advance from the north and south towards Kursk and trap the Soviets in a huge pocket. This pocket could then be systematically destroyed. To make the plan work, however, the attack would have to be launched quickly before the Russians had time to prepare defenses. The initial plan had May as the start date, but various delays forced the start date back to July, by which time the Russians had prepared defensive positions that would present the Germans with formidable obstacles. The Russian victory at Stalingrad had shown that the mighty German army could be defeated. The seemingly endless resources of Russia in both men and machines could and would be sacrificed to ensure the ultimate goal was achieved. The Russian offensive launched after Stalingrad had been intended to build on the recent successes, but what was not expected was the ability of the German soldier to recover quickly. The Russians suffered a surprise defeat at Kharkov in March 1943, just 1 month after the surrender at Stalingrad. Stalin was keen to advance further, but Zhukov and others persuaded Stalin that a defensive posture was more suitable at this stage of the war. The Russians were also fully aware of the German plans, as they had been receiving information from the Lucy spy ring. This reliable source was fed from Bletchley Park in England. The scientists working at this top-secret location had broken the secret German Enigma code at the start of the war, and had been watching developments very closely ever since. They passed information to the Soviets via an intricate web of contacts situated in Switzerland. Although the Russians never knew the true source of the information, they came to rely upon its accuracy. They were therefore given the dates of the planned German attacks in advance and began to prepare accordingly. massive defensive belts were constructed, with the sole purpose of the destruction of German armor and men. Zhukov, the master tactician, also gathered strong reserves that would be unleashed when the time was right. This well-prepared trap would be the launch pad for the defeat of Germany in the East. Georgy Zhukov gained his first military experience under the Tsarist army during World War I. He actually changed sides during the war and joined the Communists during the revolution in 1917. Zhukov served in various positions after the war and became an early expert in the use of armor. He managed to escape the purges of 1937 that cost so many their lives. His first real success came against Japan at Khalkhin Gol during 1939, and he then played his part in the successful defense of Leningrad. He was given the responsibility for the defense of Stalingrad in late 1942, when he planned and executed the first major defeat of the German army. Zhukov was a quick-tempered man who intensely disliked those who failed in their duty. Konstantin Rokossovsky was one of the Soviet advisors during the Spanish Civil War. He was also caught up in the purges of 1937. He escaped death, but did spend a period in prison. He was called back into service to help in the defense of Moscow in 1941, and also had the control of the Don front during the Stalingrad battle. He was in command of the Central Front during the Battle of Kursk. Pavel Rotmistrov was also an early advocate of tank warfare. He first had command of the Russian 7th Tank Corps and was involved in the fighting around Rostov and Stalingrad, where he formed his tactical ideas. It was Rotmistrov who first suggested the use of complete armor-only formations. This tactic was adopted, and he subsequently gained command of the 5th Guards Tank Army. A very able commander, Rotmistrov had the appearance of a quiet schoolteacher, but the mind and determination of a brilliant military tactician. Ivan Konev, born in 1897, served the Tsar during the First World War as an NCO. By 1917, he had become a communist and joined the Russian Revolution, serving as a political commissar. He then joined the Red Army and graduated successfully from the Frunze Military Academy. In August 1941, he served in the Transcaucasian Military District inside the Smolensk sector. In October 1941, he became commander of the Kalinin Front and helped to resist the German drive towards Moscow. Konev made a name for himself as an aggressive and highly competent commander, regarded by many as second only to Zhukov. He was the perfect man to command the steppe front during the Kursk offensive. Kurt Zeitzler served as an infantryman during World War I and continued his military career during the interwar years. In 1934, he transferred to the newly created tank section, which was one of a number of changes brought in under Hitler. By 1939, he had risen to the rank of colonel, his forte being organization and mechanized warfare. He held various staff positions during the first 2 years of the war, and by 1942, he was serving in the West under von Rundstedt. He played a significant role in the Allied defeat at Dieppe during that year, bringing him to the attention of Hitler. A month after Dieppe, he was promoted to general and became the chief of staff. His approach to older generals sometimes caused him problems with fellow officers, for he always spoke his mind, even clashing with Hitler on a number of occasions. He tried in vain to make Hitler see sense at Stalingrad. It was Zeitzler who drew up the plans for the Kursk offensive and its pincer attacks. Although some of the other generals voiced their concerns, Zeitzler pushed enthusiastically for the plan, which was finally approved by Hitler. Its consequences would prove disastrous for Germany. Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group South, is acknowledged as one of the most able German commanders of the Second World War. His military experience dated back to World War I, where he fought on the Western and Eastern fronts. Before the end of the war, he had reached the rank of captain. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, von Manstein was a lieutenant colonel with the German General Staff. Further promotions followed until the outbreak of World War II, when he held the rank of lieutenant general. Before the start of the war, he had been responsible for suggesting the use of the assault gun that was to become known as the Sturmgeschütz, a machine that was to play a significant part in Germany's conduct of the war. He was closely involved in planning the various opening campaigns. The successful plan for the attacks in the West in 1940 are also thought to be the brainchild of von Manstein, although Hitler later claimed them as his own. Von Manstein had a gift for determining the enemy's intentions and identifying their weaknesses. He held various field commands from the start of the war with Russia in 1941, and successes included the defeat of the fortress of Sevastopol. However, the longer the war in Russia dragged on, the more Hitler and von Manstein differed over its execution. Hitler was obsessed with holding positions to the last man, and von Manstein tried in vain to change Hitler's tactical reasoning. By the start of July 1943, von Manstein was in overall command of Army Group South, which played the major role in the execution of Plan Citadel. Hermann Hoth, born on the 12th of April 1895, served in the First World War. He remained in the German army, and by 1936, Hoth was a divisional commander. He commanded the 15th Panzer Corps during the invasion of Poland, and on the 27th of October 1939 was awarded with the Ritterkreuz for his service. Hoth went on to lead the 15th Panzer Corps through the successful French campaign of 1940. He then led Panzer Group 3, later renamed the 3rd Panzer Army, towards Leningrad and on to Moscow, where he almost succeeded in his mission. By 1942, Hoth was commander of the 4th Panzer Army and in action at Stalingrad. His mission was to get the trapped 6th Army out of the city, but the task was virtually impossible, and he failed. Hoth and his 4th Panzer Army went on to be involved at the heart of fighting at Kursk. Army Group Center under von Kluge also played a significant role in the plans for Kursk. To the north of the salient, von Kluge's army group would serve in the 9th Army that would provide one of the 2 great pincers designed to snuff out the Soviet salient. Walter Model also gained his early experiences during World War I, attaining the rank of captain. Like von Manstein, he had served in the interwar German army in various staff and field postings, including a stint as a lecturer on tactics and history. He continued in various posts in the early stages of World War II, and by mid-1940 held the rank of lieutenant general, when he was also given command of the 3rd Panzer Division. Although he was an infantryman through and through, he quickly made it his job to explore the potential of tank warfare. Model constantly visited the front lines and always took a keen interest in the welfare of his men. His division was involved in the titanic encirclement at Kiev and also the attacks towards Moscow. Model firmly believed in the concept of lightning war, and his successes did not go unnoticed by Hitler. By the start of 1942, He was in command of the 9th Army with the rank of Colonel General. He was given the task of attacking in the Rzhev sector in southern Russia. The bloody battles here would last for almost a year. By spring 1943, his 9th Army was well placed to take part in the Kursk offensive. Hitler knew just how vital the coming battle would be and placed a great deal of faith in the new tanks developed for the offensive. General Heinz Guderian had been recalled and appointed to a new position of Inspector General of the Armoured Forces, especially for the Kursk battle. The purges of 1937 upon the army by Stalin had left a weak and poorly led force. Around the start of 1941, however, the army was undergoing a reorganization. When the Germans launched their attack in June of that year, they caught the Red Army off guard. The initial advances by the Germans cut deep into the Russian rear areas. In many cases, the Germans found themselves advancing eastwards and also defending westwards as the retreating Russians caught up with them. There appeared to be no effective organization or control over the mass of Russian soldiers in the early stages. As the first winter set in, however, the first signs appeared that things were not going to go Hitler's way. Better adapted to the climate and countryside, the Russian army quickly launched their first offensive that almost succeeded in overrunning the German army. The main drawback for the Red Army was the constant interference by political commissars who instilled fear into every soldier. Often, commanders were reluctant to take key decisions without clear instructions from much higher up. This directly affected the course of the fighting and may have contributed to some of the Red Army's defeats. The Russian soldier was also dealing with new tactics being employed by the Germans. What was more, the Red Army suffered many problems of supply, and the loss of vital industrial regions and the relocation of factories further east hit production hard. As the war progressed, the Red Army became better equipped and more able to cope with the superior skills of the German army. The Red Army's sheer weight of numbers, of both men and materials, was beginning to turn the tide in their favor by mid-1943. The Russian soldier had the backup of plentiful tanks and planes, and they did not appear in the bewildering array of different types used by the German army. The most widely used battle tank was the T-34. This tank made its battlefield debut in 1941, soon after the Germans poured over the Russian border. The Germans had no prior knowledge of the T-34, and they quickly learned to respect it. The T-34's design, which remained largely unchanged throughout the war, was simple and crude, but highly practical. It had excellent sloping armor, which, although only 45 millimeters thick, increased its protective capabilities. It had wide tracks that were well suited to the Russian countryside and the worst of the Russian winter. The armaments on the version used at Kursk were a 76 millimeter dual-purpose main gun backed up with 3 7.62 millimeter machine guns. It was powered by a very reliable diesel engine and gave a top speed of 33 miles per hour. It weighed around 26 tons and had a 5-man crew. The downside was the poorly designed turret that had to be traversed by hand. It was also very cramped, with rudimentary radio communications. Fighting alongside the T-34 was the KV-1. This was a heavier tank, weighing in at over 43 tons, which also had a 5-man crew. The reliable diesel engine produced a top speed of 22 miles per hour. The armor protection was 110 millimeters thick, and like the T-34, its main gun was a 76 millimeter weapon, backed up with 3 7.62 millimeter machine guns. It carried more than adequate ammunition supplies and had excellent suspension. Unfortunately, it also had a poorly designed turret and complex gun sighting mechanism. The crews that manned them were poorly trained, and these faults conspired to ensure that the KV-1 would never have the impact of its more famous stablemate. Kursk is famed for its large tank battle, but equally as ferocious was the aerial war that raged overhead. Like their tank forces, the Russians used a few simple designs for their aircraft that were practical and produced in large numbers. The IL-2 was one of these. It would see a great deal of action around Kursk. Over 36,000 of these aircraft were manufactured before the end of the war. The IL-2 was a ground attack plane and was an excellent performer at low levels. Top speed was around 250 miles per hour. The main armaments were 2 37mm cannons and 2 7.62mm machine guns, plus 1 rear-facing machine gun for added protection. It could also carry up to 600 kilograms of bombs. As it was best suited to low-level attacks, the construction allowed for a certain amount of armor protection to be included. The main areas protected were the underside, cockpit, and fuel tanks. From its introduction in 1941, the plane was involved in most of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Although the Red Air Force pilots could not match the skills of the Luftwaffe aces, this plane and its pilots did play a significant part in the defeat of the Third Reich. The Nazi propaganda machine had described the Russians as subhuman. The German army advanced into Russia with the belief that they were up against an incapable army, poorly led and badly equipped. The first 6 months of the war produced evidence that this was indeed the case. However, as 1942 began, the Red Army started to show its true abilities. Its men were able to cope with the extreme weather fluctuations, sustaining themselves on meager rations and living off the land. They had excellent defensive skills, something that the Germans quickly learned to their cost. They also had simple but highly effective equipment that was designed for the punishing weather. The Russian Achilles' heel was their poor leadership and fear of their political masters. The tactics employed paid no heed to the cost in human lives, and penal squads and summary executions were widely used in an attempt to gain objectives. The overriding motivation of many of the men was their love of Mother Russia. Despite all of the hardships and demands placed upon them, their resilience and determination would see them through to victory. The German army of World War II was arguably one of the most efficient the modern world has seen. Superbly led by capable leaders such as Guderian, Rommel, Model, and von Manstein, they achieved victory after victory in the first years of the war. The army was extremely professional and very aggressive. Expert training saw the Wehrmacht employ new and far-thinking tactics with devastating results. These tactics helped them defeat numerically superior enemy forces and secure almost impossible objectives. For 2 years, their combined tactics and training would take them from Poland to the shores of France and then on to the banks of the Volga at Stalingrad, defeating every enemy along the way. A major problem was that the Wehrmacht had to contend with incessant infighting at higher levels. This sometimes resulted in unclear objectives, most notably during the war with Russia. Without doubt, being led by a dictator such as Hitler, whose military experience and abilities were limited, also had its effect on the final outcome of the war. Masters at the art of counterattack and equally adept in attack or defense, the German army was, however, a worthy opponent to any foe. Despite an ever-decreasing supply of resources and multiplying difficulties, they remained resolute and focused on their tasks. The heavy defeat at Stalingrad had deeply affected them, and the fact that they quickly recovered and managed a stunning victory at Kharkov is evidence of their capabilities. Contrary to popular belief, by the start of July 1943, the German army was far from defeated. The arrival of the formidable T-34 onto the battlefield caused the Germans to revive some of their pre-war plans for heavier tanks. One of the results was arguably the best tank of World War II. The Panzer Mark V, or Panther, weighed in at 45 tons. It had a 5-man crew protected by 120mm sloped armour. This tank was armed with a superb 75mm L-70 main gun with 2 7.92mm MG-34 machine guns as backup. It could produce a top speed of 30 miles per hour. It was rushed through production to ensure that it was ready for the Kursk offensive. Hitler placed great hopes on the Panther and delayed the start of the battle to allow for its production. The early models were plagued with mechanical breakdowns that would have serious consequences for the troops at Kursk. But once the design problems were rectified, the Panther tank became an excellent weapon. The Panzer Mark VI, better known as the Tiger I, was designed to put the Germans ahead of the Russians in tank design. The result was a machine that weighed in at a huge 55 tons. Its 5-man crew was well protected by 110mm thick armour. Unlike the Panther, the Tiger I had the more conventional flat-sided armour that wasn't as effective as sloped armour, but it was so thick that it was virtually impervious to any weapon on the battlefield. The Tiger's main armament was the phenomenal 88mm gun, capable of destroying anything it came across at ranges up to 2,000 meters. The close support weapons were the standard 2 MG-34 machine guns. The 21-litre engine produced a top speed of 24 miles per hour. The first large-scale deployment of the Tiger tank was at Kursk, when approximately 100 were used. They were placed mainly with the elite formations of the Waffen-SS and the Großdeutschland division. The Tiger would quickly earn a fearsome reputation and would play its part in helping the Germans smash through the extensive Russian defences during Zitadelle. This heavy tank destroyer appeared after Ferdinand Porsche's design for the Tiger I was turned down. The Porsche firm was so confident that their design would be chosen that they had begun to produce their version, but production stopped when Hitler's decision was announced. Rather than waste those that had already been constructed, they were put to use. Hitler had also ordered the design of an assault weapon that could mount the longer L-71 version of the 88mm gun. The Tiger I was incapable of doing this, so the 90 Porsche chassis were chosen. The resulting weapon, Ferdinand, weighed in at a colossal 68 tons and required a crew of 6 men. The armour protection was provided by 200mm of steel plate. The top speed was only 12 miles per hour. The Ferdinand was rushed through the production stage with very serious consequences for the crews manning them and the infantry who were relying on them during the fighting. During the design stage, the need for a close-quarter defence machine gun was overlooked. The suspension was not adequate to support the weight of the tank destroyer, with the result that the vehicle easily bogged down. These flaws helped to ensure that the battlefield debut of the Ferdinand was a failure. 40 of the 80 machines which took part in the battle were lost to the enemy within the first 3 days. One other important new development made its arrival known during the Kursk offensive. The Stuka dive bomber had played its part in the early victories of the German army. It became an excellent psychological weapon and instilled terror again and again. However, as the war progressed, this slow aircraft was quickly outclassed by the faster enemy planes. The Stuka had undergone a few modifications since its first introduction in 1937. The standard version, available in early 1943, could reach a speed of around 255 miles per hour. The armament was 2 7.92mm machine guns situated on the wings, with a further rear-facing machine gun. It could carry up to 1,800 kilograms of bombs. The Stuka was widely used, and during March of 1943, testing took place on a new anti-tank version. 2 37mm flak cannons were fitted to the underside of the plane in place of the bomb load. It was soon found that this weapon was very accurate and effective for destroying enemy tanks, although the pilots had to go into a shallow dive and get within close range of their targets, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The use of this new weapon became the responsibility of some of Germany's best-known pilots, among them Hans-Ulrich Rudel, an accomplished airman who held Germany's highest award for bravery. Rudel, and the pilots like him, put the new tank-busting variant to good use and quickly chalked up a high number of enemy tank kills. The restrictions imposed on Germany after the First World War included a limit on the size of her army. Although painful for the Germans, this restriction would have noticeable benefits when war finally broke out again. The selection process was rigorous, and only the best candidates were chosen. As the political situation changed and the army expanded, these carefully chosen men moved up the ranks and passed their skills down to many others. Another result of the interwar restrictions was that even the most junior soldier was trained to take the place of his superior. With some brilliant tacticians and military minds leading them, and supplied with good equipment, the German army of 1939 was a truly formidable opponent. Unleashed into Poland in September of that year, the skills learned were put to good use. Quick, decisive campaigns followed, one after the other, over the next 18 months. The average German soldier that crossed the Russian border in June 1941 was a well-trained, battle-experienced, and very capable man. Determined and professional, the German soldier of World War II would prove his ability again and again. April 1943 saw the German army in desperate need of recuperation after their recent victory at Kharkov. The Russian army was also in danger of outrunning its own extended supply lines. These two factors resulted in a period of relative quiet over the Kursk region. But as German intentions became clear, the Russians began an intensive program of defensive measures that were designed to trap and blunt the German armor. Thousands of anti-tank guns were built into defensive lines in great depth, and millions of anti-tank mines were laid. Both sides prepared for the coming clash throughout May and June 1943. Expectations were high. Both believed that they could achieve a decisive victory, but the commanders of both sides were apprehensive. They could sense the importance of the forthcoming clash and could see how its outcome would affect the future course of the war. The armies facing each other in the Kursk salient in the late spring of 1943 knew the vital importance of victory in the coming battle. The halting of the Russian offensive in March had brought a lull to the southern sector of the Russian front, an area that had seen horrific and savage fighting for more than 6 blood-soaked months. As the German intention to attack became clear, an intense period of preparation began for the two opposing armies. The halting of the German advances at Stalingrad seriously affected German morale. But the stunning victory in the face of defeat at Kharkov in March 1943 helped to restore faith in the task at hand. The Russians were keen to make the most of their Stalingrad victory and were confident that they were finally starting to defeat the German forces. Their plans suffered a setback at Kharkov. And after this intensive battle, both sides drew their breath and prepared for the next phase of the struggle. The lull that descended over this region allowed the plans to be drawn up and the preparations to begin. Neither the Russians nor the Germans had infinite resources, and it was imperative that one side or the other secured a decisive victory. Hitler and Stalin, Zhukov and Manstein knew how critical the situation was, and they began to put their plans into action. The brilliant tactician Zhukov commanded the Russians. He wasted no time in taking the measures needed to defeat the Germans. After all, he was familiar with the tactics employed by the invaders and had been instrumental in their biggest setbacks to date. As a defensive strategy had been decided upon, the first steps were to prepare defensive positions from which the Red Army would be able to halt and destroy the German forces. The only way that this would be possible for the overstretched Red Army of 1943 would be by enlisting the help of the civilian population. In the now secure rear areas, the repair of installations damaged or destroyed in the towns recently recaptured began in earnest. With a focus on the need to move vast supplies, feverish work on bridges, road and rail networks was undertaken. The main rail line into Kursk from the east was a hive of activity. Closer to the front line, work also began on the vast defensive belts that were later to entrap the Germans. In all, the Russians prepared a total of 5 main defensive lines. The first 2 lines ran around the perimeter of the pocket to a depth of around 10 to 12 miles and were situated close to each other. The remaining lines were spaced apart and ran to a depth of over 150 miles in total. Zhukov was clearly taking no chances. Within these defensive lines, construction began on individual positions that were to blunt the expected strong German armoured attacks. Hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were sent to the area. Cheap, easy to manufacture, but highly effective, these devices were planted in huge quantities. Estimates suggest a figure of up to 5,000 mines per mile of front. Other tried and tested measures, such as anti-tank ditches and barbed wire, were also widely employed. The intention was to draw in, hold up, and then destroy the attacker. Overall, it was an excellent demonstration of what could be achieved by the effective use of the engineering skills and materials at hand. Although the Citadel plan was approved in early May, the start date was continually delayed. Hitler's desire to leave no room for error saw him postpone again and again. Various factors caused these delays. One was the production of the new Panther tanks. These delays only helped the preparations of the Russian defences that were very apparent to the German reconnaissance aircraft that flew over and photographed the area countless times. All the while, the highly efficient Lucy spy ring continued to feed the Soviets with accurate information, telling the Soviets exactly where and when the Germans would strike. The aerial phase of the coming battle was to assume an importance almost equal to the fighting on land. The number of aircraft that did battle was vast, with around 2,000 planes on the German side, lined up against almost 3,000 on the Russian. The Russian Air Force had improved steadily since the 1941 German invasion, and they were, by this stage of the war, a well-equipped and well-organized force. They had also managed to gain a vital numerical superiority over the Luftwaffe. In the run-up to the battle, the Luftwaffe flew many aerial missions. During June, they destroyed over 300 Russian planes by various means. Their aim was to secure the Orel sector. As the battle got underway, the Luftwaffe became heavily involved. On the 9th of July, the 1st Air Division actually attacked an armoured Russian spearhead near the main Orel to Bryansk railway, and they managed to blunt this potentially dangerous development. When they flew away at the end of the day, hundreds of Soviet tanks lay shattered or in flames. In the south also, the Luftwaffe assisted in the advance of the Panzer forces, helping to avoid catastrophe on more than one occasion. For Kursk, 4 main Russian air armies were available. The 16th Air Army was responsible for the northern sector of the pocket, and the 2nd Air Army provided cover in the south. Nearby was the 17th Air Army, with the 15th Air Army situated further back. The number of planes available to the Russians was evenly split 3 ways. Approximately 1,000 bombers, 1,000 ground attack, and 1,000 fighter planes were available for the coming clash. Facing the Russian pilots were 2 German air groups. Luftflotte 6 was situated with Model's forces of Army Group Center in the north, whilst Luftflotte 4 was placed near Hoth's 4th Army in the south. The disposition of the German air groups in this area produced a ratio of 2 bombers to 1 fighter. Like all parts of the German armed services, the Luftwaffe had suffered massive losses over the previous 2 years. The numerical superiority enjoyed by the Russians also severely hampered German attempts to retain control. Underneath their protective air umbrellas, the soldiers and tank crews on the ground busied themselves with their preparation. Zhukov poured huge amounts of men and materials into the area, and great emphasis was placed on the use of artillery. No fewer than 20,000 artillery pieces would be used during this coming battle. Like mines, artillery pieces were easier and cheaper to manufacture than tanks. The numbers of Russian soldiers sent into the Kursk salient area exceeded 1.3 million. In the north of the salient was the Central Front, under the command of General Rokossovsky. In the south was the Voronezh Front, commanded by General Vatutin. In reserve behind the salient was the Steppe Front, under the control of General Konyev. The bulk of the Soviet armor was placed incorrectly in the northern sector of the salient, as the Russians felt this area would receive the hardest blow. This would cause problems for Zhukov in the early stages of the battle. Some 900,000 German soldiers were committed to the Battle of Kursk. Not only were they outnumbered from the outset, they also bore the burden of having to take the offensive. The German forces were positioned under the personal supervision of Hitler. From the Army Group Center, the 9th Army in the north, under Field Marshal Model, had 5 corps to call upon. In the sector of Army Group South was General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. To Hoth's right were Army Detachment Kempf. The deposition of the new panzers reflected the emphasis of the south in the German attack plan. Around 90 Tigers and just over 100 of the new Panther tanks were to be found in this region. This was by far the biggest gathering of the new generation of German tanks, and much was expected of them. The plan of attack was simple. It was to smash through the Russian defences and meet behind Kursk. But one important factor was missing: an effective reserve force. This was no longer possible for the Germans at this stage in the war. Although the Russians were receiving intelligence information from the Lucy spy ring, this was at a higher level and did not give enough detail on the front line changes that occurred. The sheer sizes of the opposing armies involved made it impossible to conceal them effectively. The increasing aerial armada was put to good use as extensive reconnaissance from the air was carried out. The Germans actually commented that they had photographed every piece of the intended battlefield area in the run-up to the start date. The main defensive measures used by the Russians could be seen from the air, but the more detailed gun emplacements were still expertly hidden. A number of dummy positions were constructed as a time-tested means of fooling the enemy. German confidence was running high, and nothing they saw altered their decision to attack. The Russians also used information gathered from captured prisoners. Special raids were carried out in order to snatch prisoners for this purpose. The Germans too used this type of information gathering. Before any major operation, the radio traffic passing among the enemy units increased dramatically, with specially trained troops intercepting it. It is impossible to know fully the intentions of the enemy, but through the use of these various methods, a clearer picture of their plans can be determined. By the 5th of July 1943, everything was in place. The vast quantities of men, tanks, ammunition, guns and planes were in their positions. Every person, from the infantry right up to army group commanders, was in a state of anticipation and excitement. The reliable information provided to the Soviet sources revealed the date and the time of the German attack, which was further confirmed by captured German prisoners. Zhukov therefore planned a huge preemptive artillery strike against the German positions. The aim was to catch the Germans as they began to assemble, and thus deliver a severe psychological blow to the enemy, even before a shot had been fired. In the central front area, the Russian artillery opened up, and for almost an hour, hundreds of guns fired towards the suspected enemy emplacements. In the north, Model's forces quickly recovered from the Russian barrage and began to reply with their own artillery attack. And over the northern part of the Kursk salient, the noises, flashes of light, death and destruction reached a ferocious intensity. The actual losses suffered by both sides were not as high as expected. The difficulty was that the artillery strike on the enemy was made during the hours of darkness, and positions were not known in detail. The effects of the strike could not be seen from the ground, nor, more importantly, from the air, which meant that correction action could not be taken. Zhukov had taken a gamble by ordering the artillery strike, and it was soon discovered that the results fell short of expectations. As this duel between the two sides continued, elements of Luftflotte 6 arrived to begin ferocious attacks on suspected Russian positions. Amid the thunder of exploding shells, the German infantry and panzers moved out against the enemy lines. Almost immediately, Model's troops ran into the well-prepared Russian killing zones. The snail-like pace of the German attack helped the Russians to inflict losses on the Germans with ease. Model was fast discovering that the Russian forces presented a virtual brick wall in the path of his advance. He urged his troops forward to try and discover a weak point in the Russian lines. The German plan had given the main Orel to Kursk railway as the advance line, and the town of Ponyri as the first major objective. But this was changed as the strength of the defences became clear, and the main emphasis of the attack was shifted towards Olkhovatka, further west. The first day's fighting had achieved an advance of only 6 miles. The push towards Olkhovatka continued on the second day of battle. The enemy defences near Ponyri on the left flank were too strong for the Germans to achieve a breakthrough, and Model had to push on in any direction possible. Russian reserves had been moved towards this area during the night of the 5th of July, and they began to commit themselves to the battle on the 6th. As daylight broke over this northern area, both sides locked together in a bitter struggle to gain their separate objectives. The Tiger tanks of the 505th Schwere Abteilung were fully committed to the battle by the anxious Germans. They slammed into the Soviet defences and the increasing number of Soviet forces moving into the area, but made limited headway as the defensive measures employed by Rossukhovsky had been well planned. They had to cope with the infantry's T-34s, anti-tank guns, and anti-tank rifles. Slowly, the Tiger tank losses mounted, reducing their effectiveness and, more importantly, their influence on the battle. Russian aircraft had also begun to make their presence felt by attacking German targets. German and Russian pilots duelled for control of the skies over the northern sector. The Soviet defensive wall in the northern part of the salient slowed Model's advance to a mere crawl. These delays kept his forces contained within a relatively small area, thus helping the Russians to plan effective countermeasures. But the Russians did not have it all their own way. The Germans fought well, Luftflotte 6 flew countless sorties over the northern part of the battlefield and helped to inflict losses on the ever-increasing number of Russian forces moving into the area. The German troops on the ground moved slowly towards Olkhovatka as the forces of Rokossovsky rushed forward to intercept them. Model's forces managed to take control of Ponry on the left flank and also the town of Teploy on the right flank. These advances represented the furthest points reached in the northern sector by the forces of Model's 9th Army. The Russian defences and weight of numbers presented Model with a barrier that he failed to penetrate. It was now apparent that the forces available to Model were insufficient to smash through the Russian lines. The new Ferdinands had also proved inadequate during the fight. A design flaw had failed to fit the new heavy tank destroyers with any close support machine guns. As they became separated from the supporting infantry and bogged down in the Russian defences, enemy troops were able to close right up alongside them and easily disable them. The Tigers were also not suited to close-quarter fighting, where their superior guns could not be used effectively. Ferocious battles raged over the area as both sides sought an advantage, but none was gained. The area descended into stalemate over the next few days. The total distance covered by Model's 9th Army in the northern sector of the Kursk salient during Zitadel was around 12 miles. The capture of Kursk, if achieved, would not be sufficient to defeat the Russian forces in this area. Model's forces were contained in an area that was around 40 miles short of their target. If Kursk were to fall to Hoth's men, a gap of this size would allow the Russians to pour reinforcements into the salient at their will. Powerless to influence the battle any further, Model contented himself with holding on to the areas already captured. The German forces in the north had been stalled. But the real focus of this most historic of battles was in the south. In the southern sector, Hoth's 4th Army enjoyed the largest concentration of tanks under the control of the best divisions in the German order of battle. The 4th of July 1943 saw a different start for Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Hoth decided to jump ahead of the planned start date of the attack. Aircraft from Luftflotte 4 began the attack on the enemy-held positions, followed by a German artillery barrage. As this barrage lifted, the infantry and tanks moved forward to engage the enemy, and throughout the day, the front line was pushed back in favor of the Germans. The fighting was heavy, and in some areas, the objectives given were not taken until the hours of darkness. This was the first in a series of setbacks for the Russians in the south. These setbacks accumulated steadily over the next few days. The 5th of July began with the 4th Panzer Army in control of the vital high ground. Hoth was keen to get things moving. and he began the next stage of his plan. He ordered a change to the planned route of advance so that the main advance would be moving more to the left. This change was not apparent to Vatutin or Stavka, as Hoth had made his decision without consulting higher command, and therefore Lucy did not pick it up. The German artillery in the southern region was therefore able to deliver its attack first. As this was happening, the Russian Air Force was on its way to attack the German airfields. But the Germans detected their approach and quickly sent their own planes to intercept. An intensive air battle ensued over the southern part of the salient as the German fighters tore into the Russian formations. At the end of the engagement, the Luftwaffe of Luftflotte 4 was in control of the air. Against this backdrop, the panzers moved forward. The removal of the aerial threat and the fact that the Russian ground units were expecting a different focus of attack allowed the German tanks to smash through the defensive positions. The Russians realized that they were wrong in their estimates of the disposition of the enemy armored foundations, and that they were about to bear the brunt of the strong enemy forces lined up in front of them. The Germans were using a new tactic based on the new heavy tanks, which was known as a Panzer Kiel, or armored wedge. This tactic placed the heavier Tigers at the tip of the wedge, with the Panthers forming the outer edges. The weaker Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs were placed in the center of the wedge. The Russians were not prepared for the rate of the German advances. Their defensive positions did inflict losses on the Germans, and they held fast in many areas. By the end of the first day, some of the 4th Panzer Army had advanced up to 15 miles. This was more than Model's forces managed in 8 days. It could have been much further, but late changes of orders meant that insufficient time had been left for mine clearance. An enraged General Guderian watched as many of his priceless German Tigers were needlessly destroyed by mines. By the end of the 3rd day's fighting, the Germans had made an advance of around 20 miles. This was beginning to cause concern for the Russians. So much that they ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army and other reserves to be moved from the steppe front and into the area of Prokhorovka. The main defensive sector for the Russians was the town of Oboyan, 35 miles south of Kursk. The Russians had placed strong forces in this area, as they were aware of the importance of holding this town. This was the left flank of Hoth's attack plan. The strength of the defences around this area became clear to the Germans, and Hoth decided to switch the emphasis of his attacks to the east. The Sel River, which runs between Oboyan and Prokhorovka, became the focus for the SS Totenkopf division. The SS Liebstandarte division would take the center, and the SS division Das Reich would hold the right flank. By the time they got to Prokhorovka, the Russians had already placed their reserves. The ferociousness of the preceding day's fighting was about to be dwarfed in scale and intensity. The right flank of the German advance in the south consisted of Army Detachment Kempf. To start with, they would advance directly east, below the town of Belgorod. They would then change direction and advance north to link with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The first obstacle for Kempf's men was the Donets River, which ran through Belgorod and along the front of the planned route of advance. Kempf's men fought well, and by the end of the first day, they had crossed the river and set up a defensive horseshoe position. Their advance continued over the next few days, despite increasing resistance. Hoth's plan envisaged a link-up between his men and Kempf's men around Prokhorovka, a move that would have put the Germans in a very strong position. The drawback to this plan was that by the 11th of July, Kempf's forces were situated roughly 12 miles south of the intended target. They still had a lot of ground to cover, and the possibility loomed that they would be unable to resist the struggle towards Prokhorovka. The upper reaches of the Donets River also stretched towards Prokhorovka, which meant that Kempf's men would have to force a crossing of this river a second time. The task ahead of them was difficult, but this did not prevent them from continuing with their attempts. As the decisive battle raged around Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, Kempf's men were positioned about 10 miles short of this objective. They did not actually link up with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps until 3 days later. This was too late to assist in the decisive battle, and too late to change Hitler's decision regarding the future course of this engagement. The two armies were now on a direct collision course. The Russians knew of the armor-led force bearing down on them and were ready to meet and destroy the threat. The Germans, however, were not aware of the strong enemy concentration of tanks that was facing them. The Russians had managed to place around 850 of their tanks in the surrounding area. The Germans had around 300 usable tanks advancing directly in the battle zone, with a further 230 fighting to their left. Hoth felt that he had inflicted serious losses on the Russians and was expecting a quick victory that would open the way for a rapid advance. The Russians knew it was vital to hold on and move their important reserves from Konyev's area to Prokhorovka. The dawn of the 12th of July would see an unprecedented clash of tanks that would decide the outcome of the whole campaign. Before the tanks played their part, the customary aerial attacks began, and the German planes swooped in on enemy positions. The next stage was an artillery attack, delivered by the Russians towards the German lines. And while the shells rained down, the Russian tanks broke out of their positions. This move coincided with the start of the German tank advance. Neither side could have foreseen or planned what occurred next. The two tank advances smashed into each other, head-on. From this point onwards, all control of the battle disappeared, and total confusion set in. The planes and artillery that would have usually joined in the battle were rendered impotent, as the close proximity of the machines and the swirling dust clouds made it impossible to tell friend or foe apart. Rather than risk destroying their own machines, the air forces of both sides were left with no option other than to let the tanks get on with the battle. The German Tigers and Panthers could not make effective use of their long-range guns, and to their horror, they discovered that the Russian tanks were able to penetrate their armor at this short range. Another tactic employed by the numerically superior Russians was to drive straight into the German tanks and ram them, completely destroying both machines and their occupants. The Soviets knew that their tanks could always be replaced, but for the Germans, at the limit of their capability, each Tiger lost was lost forever. As the Germans desperately sought a line of advance through the storm, the failure of Kemp's forces to reach the battle area was having deadly consequences for them. The battle ebbed and flowed all day with no decisive outcome. At some stages during the day, the Germans did appear to be on the verge of a breakthrough, but the Russians sent new reserves into the line and succeeded in holding the Germans. As darkness fell, the battlefield grew quiet. Both sides were exhausted and made the most of the enforced lull. No time was wasted, however, on preparing to resume the next day. The short climax to the Kursk offensive resulted in the end of Germany's successes in the east. The 12-hour battle had drawn in and chewed up the best divisions that Hitler possessed. Tanks and men had been lost at a steady rate since the start of the offensive. And by the time they reached Prokhorovka, they were in no fit state to sustain a heavy attack. The Germans had maintained fairly constant numbers of tanks in the field through the skill of the tank repair shops. But the size of the enemy forces facing them and their lack of a reserve prevented any further advances. The Russians had lost over 400 tanks in the battle thus far and were themselves left in a vulnerable position by the end of the day. They expected the Germans to begin the following day with a sizable attack. During the night of July the 12th, the Russians and Germans recovered what vehicles they could from the battlefield and readied them for use again. The 13th, however, would not see the Germans resume their attempts to advance. It would actually see a direct Führer order calling off the Citadel offensive. The order to call off the attacks surprised von Manstein, as he could sense the cracks beginning to appear in the Russian defenses. One of the main reasons for the postponement of Citadel had nothing to do with the Russian front. It was the recent Allied invasion of Sicily, which took place on the 10th of July. Hitler, who was always conscious of the changing political situation, could see the dangers that this development presented. He simply needed to pull troops out of the line and send them to meet this new threat. One of the formations ordered out was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The moves did not begin straight away, however, and when they did, only some divisions were moved. This new development meant that Hitler was faced with the one situation he had tried to avoid from the moment his troops had crossed the Polish border in 1939. A war on two fronts. From this point onwards, the war would not be fought on Hitler's terms, but on the terms of his enemies, who were growing stronger with each passing day. From now on, they decided where the next battle would be fought. This left Hitler powerless to do anything but move his decreasing forces to meet each new threat. On the 13th of July, the Russians began their probing attacks in the sector north of Orel. By this stage, Model's forces had created their own bulge that was flanked on both sides by strong Russian formations. These probing attacks gained momentum, and by the 16th of July had turned into an all-out counteroffensive. The Germans had not prepared any defensive positions in these areas and could not hold the Russian attacks. The Russians were fighting over familiar ground and had the benefit of being able to use their rested formations from the Bryansk and Western fronts. They steadily pushed Model's 9th Army back in the north to the Hagen defensive line. And by the end of the first week in August 1943, the town of Orel was back in Russian hands. Around this time, the counteroffensive in the southern area was gaining momentum and also regaining lost ground at a steady pace. By the end of August, Kharkov would come under Russian control for the final time. The Russian advances, although steady, were not easy. The Germans defended resolutely and exacted a heavy toll on the advancing enemy troops. The Russians, however, could replace their losses and relentlessly pushed ahead. They had scented victory, and the ultimate defeat of the enemy was becoming an ever-increasing possibility. One of the main purposes of the Citadel offensive was to straighten the line for the Germans and free up much-needed troops for the Allied invasion expected in the near future. By the end of August 1943, the front line had been straightened. The only problem for Hitler was that it was 100 miles in favor of Stalin's troops. Further key divisions had been taken out of the area in an attempt to deal with the situations developing elsewhere. The Russian front had become little more than a holding action, where each new threat had to be countered in the best way possible. The rotten edifice that Hitler spoke of in his planning of Barbarossa was a fantasy. The reality was a strong and determined country that would swallow millions of his troops in the titanic battles that raged from June 1941 to May 1945. Battles that ended at the very doors of Hitler's bunker in Berlin. Hitler had placed everything on one last throw of the dice. The gamble would ultimately mean the end for his beloved fatherland and divide the rest of Europe for 45 years. In early 1940, the first attempts were made by the Royal Air Force to bomb Germany. The first attacks were largely ineffective, but these early attempts eventually grew into raids involving over 1,000 aircraft and were carried out almost continuously. Later in the war, the RAF would be joined by the United States Army Air Force. The merciless air offensive saw whole cities razed to the ground and countless road and rail networks severed. This terrible aspect of the Second World War saw the death of hundreds of thousands of German civilians and tens of thousands of Allied aircrew members. The air war would be crucial in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Hitler's troops crossed the Dutch border on the 10th of May 1940 to begin their Western campaign. Over the next 6 weeks, the world was introduced to the concept of blitzkrieg. The armies of Holland, Belgium, France and Britain were overrun and captured, or pushed into the pocket at Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force's presence in France during this time was limited and was no match for the Luftwaffe's strength or speed of advance. With the Allied evacuation of Dunkirk at the start of June 1940 and the formal French surrender towards the end of June, all eyes turned to Britain. Even as the battle for France was raging, the Luftwaffe was turning its attention to Britain. Piecemeal attacks were launched towards the coastal areas and some Allied sea convoys. Hitler had ordered that the RAF must be defeated before the planned invasion of Britain could take place. The Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, had assured Hitler that this would be guaranteed. From the start of July until the middle of September 1940, Germany's Luftwaffe and Britain's RAF locked horns in a duel for control of the skies over England. Losses to both sides were heavy, as the battle edged in favor of one side and then the other. However, the RAF, who were fighting over home territory and had an excellent command structure and support network, eventually gained the edge and forced Hitler to postpone his invasion indefinitely and rethink his strategy. Winston Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874. His early adult life was a mix of army service and politics. He gained fame as a hero of the Boer War and limited fortune as a political correspondent. He became an MP for the first time in 1900. 10 years later, he became the First Lord of the Admiralty, where he had a checkered history. Churchill was responsible for modernizing the Navy before the First World War, but he was also accountable for the ensuing disaster at Gallipoli. The interwar years saw him alternate between politics and writing. The writing kept him financially afloat, but his political life was less successful and made him many enemies. Crucially, Churchill was one of the few people who foresaw the danger that Adolf Hitler represented. The outbreak of war in September 1939 saw Churchill back in his previous position as First Lord of the Admiralty. Despite the fact that Churchill was responsible for a failed seaborne operation in Norway, this second failed operation removed Chamberlain from power, and Churchill was asked to step in and head a new government. Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, the same day that Hitler's troops crossed the Dutch border to begin their Western offensive. He was unprepared and powerless to prevent the lightning advances of the German army in these early decisive campaigns that culminated in the evacuation of the Allies from Dunkirk. Churchill was, however, instrumental in guiding the British public through the difficult times arising from Dunkirk and the subsequent Battle of Britain. He wasted no time in retaliating. The opportunity was seized to send the bombers of the RAF over to Germany to stem the tide of Hitler's campaign. Churchill's philosophy of hitting back in any way possible would prove to be a thorn in Hitler's side, and it gained valuable time for Britain to strengthen its forces. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born on the 30th of January 1882. Roosevelt had a very different childhood from his British ally. He had a loving upbringing and a good education that ultimately led to Harvard. Having a family member, Theodore Roosevelt, as President of the United States, was influential in his decision to follow this path, and in his 20s, Franklin was determined to become a politician. His first attempt succeeded at the age of 28 in 1910, when he became a member of the State Senate. Like Churchill, he became involved in naval affairs before the First World War and took up the position as assistant to the Naval Secretary. At the start of the 1920s, his political life continued apace, but in a country that was becoming more and more isolationist. He was stricken with the disease polio, and the paralysis would confine him to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. This required him to drop out of politics for a while, but when he returned with an increased enthusiasm. The 1932 election would finally see Roosevelt elected to the position of President of the United States, winning re-election in 1936. The end of the 1930s saw an increasing menace in the guise of Adolf Hitler. This was regarded as a European problem, and the American public opposed any form of involvement. Roosevelt, however, gained approval for sending aid to Britain in her time of need. Hitler's declaration of war against America in the wake of the Japanese attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 dragged America into the Second World War. After the initial shock of this attack, the American nation threw itself wholeheartedly into the war effort. Some of Hitler's generals had visited America during the 1930s and had warned Hitler of the manufacturing capabilities of this huge nation, something which Hitler chose to ignore. Over the next 4 years, America poured vast quantities of men and materials into the Allied struggle for freedom. As had been agreed with Churchill, the defeat of Germany was the first priority. Hitler would feel the might of America, and he would have no effective way to hit back at the seemingly limitless resources that the combined Allies threw against him. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died in April 1945, 3 weeks before the Nazi surrender. He could be content, however, in the knowledge that his actions had ensured an inevitable defeat. Adolf Hitler was born in April 1889. He had a difficult upbringing, with a father who could be brutal and alienating. He had a stronger bond with his mother, but she died before he was 20 years old. Like his adversary Churchill, Hitler's school years were not promising. His real passion was painting, at which he tried in vain to make a living. With the outbreak of World War I, he volunteered for service and found his sense of belonging and direction. During the next 4 years, he was decorated twice for bravery and also wounded and temporarily blinded. Following the Great War, he moved into the world of politics and discovered his skills as an orator. He became a member of the German Workers' Party in 1919, a party that he was soon to lead and rename the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Hitler saw himself as Germany's saviour, and over the next 13 years he increased his political control, as well as his power and popularity among the masses. But after a failed attempt by the growing Nazi Party to overthrow the Bavarian government in 1923, Hitler was imprisoned for 9 months. He finally achieved his ambition of becoming German Chancellor in 1933, and wasted no time in gaining control of all aspects of German life. The years between 1936 and 1939 saw Hitler trying the patience of Western powers as he expanded the territories under his control. The gamble finally failed on the 3rd of September 1939, when Britain and France declared war on Germany over the invasion of Poland. Hitler's next objective was the speedy defeat of his enemies, and between September 1939 and June 1940, the soldiers of Poland, Holland, Belgium, France and Britain fell under the might of the Wehrmacht. These overwhelming victories left Hitler with the conviction that his chosen path was the right one. With the escape of the bulk of the British expeditionary force at Dunkirk, the remaining obstacle to the completion of total victory in the West was the surrender of Britain. To accomplish this, Hitler knew that the defeat of the Royal Air Force was essential. He entrusted this to his Air Force Chief Hermann Göring. If the Royal Air Force could be defeated, Hitler sustained the hope that the invasion of Britain would not be necessary. This invasion would be a very difficult task against an experienced and strong opponent. Göring's Luftwaffe failed to defeat the Royal Air Force, and Hitler had to postpone the invasion of Britain indefinitely. He then undertook his biggest gamble yet by invading Soviet Russia in June 1941. To proceed with this massive venture whilst Britain remained undefeated was a huge error, which would cost Hitler dearly, and over the next 4 years would contribute significantly to Germany's eventual defeat in 1945. The Royal Air Force's defeat of the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain was critical to the survival of Britain. But there was an even greater significance that would not become apparent for a few years yet. The victory bought time for Britain to prepare and retrain its armed forces, and to manufacture munitions and equipment that had been depleted during the disaster in France. While all of this was taking place, Churchill decided to hit back in the only way possible at this stage of the war. The need for a strike force capable of carrying war overseas was essential. Introducing Royal Air Force bombers ensured that Britain could extend its reach over mainland Europe with ease. Most nations involved in World War I had made various attempts at using planes to deliver bombs. There were varying degrees of success, as the planes of the time were flimsy and slow. But Britain had developed her bombing techniques in the interwar years. They were convinced of the importance of the bomber, and held the belief that the bomber would always get through. This not only enabled them to shape their offensive strategy, but also helped deal with the threat from an enemy force. Churchill's decision to hit back saw the use of the early two-engine bombers of the Royal Air Force, such as Whitleys and Blenheims. These planes ran into difficulties against the seasoned fighters of the Luftwaffe. It was only later, when the larger four-engine Lancasters and Stirlings were introduced, that things improved in Britain's favour. Hitler's declaration of war on America gave fresh weight to the bombing attacks over Germany. America had the use of advanced aircraft, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, a high-altitude bomber that gave the Luftwaffe some real grounds for concern. Britain's refusal to surrender to the Germans in 1940 was fundamental to the Allied victory. If defeated, all British air bases would have been out of bounds to American aircraft. The combined efforts and tactical superiority of Britain and America would ultimately force Germany to accept defeat. Germany's geographical position is not favourable for defensive purposes. The political situation that was prevalent during the early part of the 20th century meant that potential enemies surrounded Germany, and some controlled large armies. When Hitler began to rearm in the mid-1930s, he was going against the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. By limiting the size of her army and navy and forbidding her to have an air force, the aim of the Treaty of Versailles was to disable Germany's offensive capabilities. The reality was that these restrictions actually favoured Germany, as it allowed her to select the best available candidates to serve in her small armed services. Hitler had an offensive strategy. He was, however, acutely aware of the dangers of having so many potential enemies close by, so a defensive plan on home soil was not neglected. A game of seesaw developed, of attack and counterattack between the two sides, as they both fought for the decisive edge. The early British bombing raids were made in daylight, with disastrous results. They quickly moved to night bombing, which was in turn met by the German development of specialized night fighting units. These squadrons had a good success rate against the British bombers, and even forced the British to scale down their operations. With the entry of America into the war, there began the tactic of day and night bombing. The Germans were developing their own radar systems to improve detection methods, and increasingly powerful radar systems were introduced. The sheer numbers of the Allied bombers, however, pushed things firmly in favour of the Allies. Before the defeat of Germany was achieved, Allied men and machines had suffered terrible losses, many due to the German defences, which were specifically designed to counter each attacking move the Allies made. An Allied pilot could expect many hazards on a typical bombing run over Germany. Flak ships were in position around the Dutch coast to give the attackers their first unpleasant experience. Based in Holland, Belgium and Germany were night fighter squadrons who developed their skills to a high degree and claimed many kills before the war's end. The closer the Allied bombers got to Germany, the heavier the defences got. These consisted of flak guns backed up with powerful searchlights. Flak guns were used in great numbers around key cities and industrial regions. Places like the Ruhr, Essen and Berlin were particularly unpleasant for the bomber crews. As the war progressed, so the defences increased. More and more raids were flying deeper into German territory. Berlin had probably the best defensive measures of all. 2 massive, heavily armed flak towers had been built, and there were hundreds of flak batteries that guarded the capital. Eventually, even these defences could not cope with the sheer numerical superiority of Britain and America. The Royal Air Force can trace its roots back to March 1912, when the formation of the Royal Flying Corps was approved. The force entered the First World War with the prime function of providing aerial observation for the ground forces, but soon progressed to air-to-air fighting. A further development saw aircraft designed to carry small bombs. The Royal Flying Corps embraced this progress, along with the other nations involved in the conflict. The early years of pioneering aerial combat were fought in flimsy aircraft that had none of the comforts of later years. The pilots were daring and resilient individuals who quickly earned respect for their bravery. They were seen as gentlemen as well as pilots, and an air of chivalry existed even at this treacherous time. By the end of hostilities in 1918, Britain would have the largest air force in the world, with a total number of 3,300 aircraft. One significant change had taken place earlier in the last year of the First War, when the Royal Flying Corps was renamed the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force would continue to develop and expand during the 1920s and 1930s, despite opposition from the longer-established Navy and Army. Entry into this new service was strict, and only the best applicants were chosen. This would become a trademark of the Royal Air Force. Theories on the future of aerial warfare, based on the experiences of pilots during the First World War, were developed during this period. The Royal Air Force felt that the bomber would be the biggest menace to an enemy during any future conflict. It was felt that the bomber could breach any defenses and deliver death and destruction on its enemy. As the development of the aeroplane gathered pace, however, it was realized that enemy bombers too would be capable of delivering a knockout blow against Britain, and the only countermeasure was its ability to carry out significant offensive operations over enemy homeland. The Royal Air Force developed its aircraft and training during the latter part of the 1930s, and in 1936, the expansion of this arm of service began in earnest. In July 1936, the Royal Air Force established separate commands that would be responsible for different areas of the air war strategy. The separate commands were Fighter Command, Bomber Command, Coastal Command, and Training Command. As developments on the continent unfolded, priority was given to the manufacture of fighter planes. This move brought opposition from Bomber Command, but it was a decision that would actually help prepare and equip Britain with the tools that would prevent her defeat during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Once this victory was assured, the development of the bomber progressed at a fast pace. What lay ahead for Britain was unclear at this stage of the war, and this period is remembered as one of the darkest in Britain's history. The Royal Air Force, however, remained professional and focused at this uncertain time. The aim was clear: the defeat of Germany. With this determination and the window of opportunity to develop their aircraft following their recent victory, the RAF would soon become established as the world's leading air force, one that other nations would try to emulate, but never match. America's use of aircraft for military purposes can also be traced back to the years before the First World War. Indeed, they were the first nation to purchase and evaluate aircraft for military use. The Americans were pioneers in some important fields. In 1910, they were the first to attempt dropping bombs from aircraft. In 1912, they were the first to install bomb sights on military planes. Despite this, America was unenthusiastic about the bomber, and little progress was made following its conception. America did set up the US Army Air Arm, but would only have 20 planes available for use when the First World War started. The Americans entered the First World War in 1917, and although aircraft would not see action over the battlefields of Europe until the spring of 1918, they would have 740 aircraft on hand by the end of the war. The Americans would try to follow the lead set by Britain. They would also run into similar opposition from the Army and Navy when expanding their air force. The period immediately following World War I would see a dramatic scaling down of the American armed services, but this did not prevent further developments being made to their military aircraft. America would lead the way in developing newer monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and radio equipment. They also manufactured twin-engine planes that were considered safer. By the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, America was coming of age. Her aircraft design had moved on significantly, and she had developed some excellent aircraft, particularly the B-17. Although America had remained neutral in the early stages of the conflict, she was aware of the increasing threat from Japan and helped Britain, her ally, with financial aid. Furthermore, agreements were made between the two countries detailing their possible joint involvement in the war. The US Army Air Corps disagreed with the Allies on how to tackle the enemy. They had been observing British operations and felt that daylight raids would achieve greater accuracy than at night, and they were sure that their heavily armed bombers could protect themselves during these daylight operations. The Americans changed the name of their Air Force to the US Army Air Force in 1942. They would have a hard task ahead of them during the Second World War, but like their British counterparts, they were well led by very capable commanders. They also had the distinct advantage of immense industrial resources that would churn out vast quantities of war materials. At the end of the conflict, America would find herself in the position of having one of the strongest air forces in the world. One man will always be associated with Bomber Command and the bombing campaign over Germany, Sir Arthur Harris. Assuming command in 1942, he had three predecessors: Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, who was in command at the start of 1940, his replacement, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Charles Portal, who remained in his post until the 5th of October 1940, and Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearce. As soon as Pearce took over, he was given new directives for the continuation of the bombing campaign. These included the destruction of Germany's oil production facilities and other targets of opportunity. This was amended in January 1941, when oil-producing targets were given priority. March saw yet another change, when the target became the German U-boat pens and shipbuilding facilities. These changes showed not only the lack of resources available to the RAF at this stage of the war, but also the scope of the threat that Britain faced on all fronts. It was around this time that the attacks on civilian targets were tentatively introduced. Owing to the inaccuracy of the bombing raids, this was deemed a more effective use of bomber firepower. In November 1941, Pearce oversaw the biggest raid on Berlin to date, when 392 planes bombed the German capital. At the end of 1941, the bombing campaign was scaled back when the Butt Report confirmed what High Command had feared, that bombers were not as effective as first thought, and the cost to the RAF was unsustainably high. Top-level talks soon took place, which would determine the future of the Allied bombing campaign. And in January 1942, Pearce was removed and given command in the Indian and Asian Theatre of Operations. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris took command of the bombing force in mid-February 1942 and held the post until the end of the war in Europe. Just before he assumed command, a new strategy had been decided. Area bombing, as it was named, would see direct attacks upon densely populated areas rather than specific military targets. The aim was the collapse of the enemy home front and morale. This controversial decision was the brainchild of Sir Charles Portal and the Air Ministry. But Arthur Harris set about enforcing the new policy with enthusiasm. He had worked in the higher echelons of the Air Ministry in the early part of the war, and his move to the command of the bomber force seemed a natural progression. He introduced the concept of repeated heavy bombing of specific targets, as opposed to the scattered bombing that had taken place previously. The targets he chose were also older towns that were known to consist mainly of wooden buildings that would easily catch fire. He set about destroying these with incendiary bombs. Harris became known as Butcher Harris among his air crews, a title that was appropriate for the man who would play a large part in the deaths of over 500,000 German civilians. But before he reached his objective, there were some hard months ahead. In the period after he assumed command, the results from the bombing campaign actually worsened. It would take some time for the odds to shift in the Allies' favour.
Since December 7th, 1941, the world has decreased in size and its shape has been considerably altered. This phenomena, which has brought disaster to our enemies, will remain as a lasting tribute to the skill of American aviation, its workers, and the personnel of the Army Air Forces. In less than 4
General
years,
Harry H. Arnold was born on the 25th of June, 1886, and he became an officer in the American Army in 1907. He joined the Signal Corps in 1911 and soon after qualified as an Army pilot. The Signal Corps had an aviation school, and Arnold became one of the instructors. He remained in administrative posts during World War I, but during the 1920s and 30s gained steady promotion until in 1938 he was appointed Chief of the Air Corps. Towards the end of 1940, he was the Chief of Staff for Air, and later rose to overall command of the Army's Air Arm in 1941. Early in this year, Americans began to arrive in Britain in the role of observers. With America's entry into the Second World War, this changed to an all-out effort to establish air bases in Britain, for which Arnold was responsible. He also saw the establishment of the 8th Air Force and chose its commanders.
the Army Air Forces played an important part in winning the war. It is equally important to ensure our winning the peace that America remain what it is today, the leading air power in the world.
General Arnold would remain a prominent figure throughout the war and would finish with the rank of 5-star general.
You and every American can play your part in maintaining the freedom and security for which we have all fought by buying and holding bonds.
General Carl A. Spaatz was born on the 28th of June, 1891. His first commission was as an infantry officer in 1914. He held various posts throughout the First World War, and by 1918 he was a pilot with the 2nd Pursuit Group, where he shot down 3 enemy aircraft. Spaatz continued his military career during the next 2 decades, and by the mid-1930s he was training as a general staff officer. By early 1939, he was the executive officer to the Chief of the Air Corps. Posted to Britain as an observer in 1940, by 1941 he was General Arnold's assistant and held the rank of Brigadier General. Spaatz returned to Britain in 1942 as First Commander of the 8th Air Force, and later the same year moved to the Mediterranean theatre. 1944 saw him return to Britain as the commander of the United States Strategic Air Force. He achieved promotion to the rank of general before the end of the war and was present at all the enemy surrenders. Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker was born on the 13th of April 1896 and was commissioned late in 1917 as an infantry officer. As the war progressed, he trained as a pilot and after the war held various staff appointments connected to the air arm. His real forte was the technical and experimental aspect of flying. Towards the end of the 1930s, Eaker was working with General Arnold in writing new theories on air warfare. By 1940, he was the executive officer to the Chief of the Air Corps. He was then sent to Britain as an observer in the autumn of 1941 and returned in early 1942 as the commander of the US 8th Bombardment Group, which took part in the heavy bombing mission of August 1942. Lieutenant General James Doolittle was born on the 14th of December 1896 and saw flying service during World War I. He placed himself in the reserves during the interwar years, but was recalled in 1940. Doolittle's first command during the Second World War was in the Pacific Theatre in the early part of 1942. He followed this by taking command of the 12th Air Force in November 1942 and then the 8th Air Force by November 1943, a post he held until the end of the war. General Nathan Twining, born on the 11th of October 1897, became an infantry officer in 1918 and did not take up flying training until 1923. He would serve in various posts during the interwar years. Twining spent much of the war in the Pacific Theatre, and by 1943 he was a brigadier general and the commander of the 13th Air Force. This capable commander was given the control of the 15th Air Force at the end of 1943, and he held this post until the end of the war in Europe. The Armstrong-Whitworth Whitley Mark V was a twin-engine bomber that first saw service in 1937. It was powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin 10 engines and crewed by 5 men. The engines could take the plane to a top speed of 230 miles per hour, which was over 100 miles per hour slower than its main adversary, the Messerschmitt 109. It could fly up to a height of 26,000 feet and had a range of 1,650 miles. The protective armament was provided by 6 0.303-inch machine guns. 2 were positioned in the nose of the aircraft, and the remaining 4 were positioned in a purpose-built gun turret at the back of the plane, the first plane to have such a feature. The offensive armament was a bomb load of up to 7,000 pounds. A total of 1,466 Mark Vs were made during the war. The Whitley was one of Britain's mainstay bombers at the outbreak of the Second World War. It was designed as a night bomber, and although various versions were made throughout its history, the Mark V was the most widely used version. This was a slow aircraft in comparison to the later 4-engine bombers of the Royal Air Force, and it was easy prey for the much faster German fighters of the Luftwaffe. In the early raids over Germany, many of these planes were simply blasted out of the sky. In the first 2 or 3 years of the Second World War, however, the Mark V and its stablemates helped to buy time for Britain, allowing her to develop larger, faster, and more effective bombers. The Vickers Wellington came into service in 1938 and was another of the early 2-engine bombers. It was powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and could achieve speeds of up to 270 miles per hour. It had a 6-man crew. The operational height of the Wellington was up to 23,500 feet with a range of 2,200 miles. It was protected by 4 0.303-inch machine guns, 2 positioned in the front and 2 in the rear. The aircraft's maximum bomb load was 4,500 pounds. Affectionately nicknamed the Wimpy by its crews, the Wellington was probably the best 2-engine bomber that the Royal Air Force possessed at the start of World War II. It was used extensively in all of the early bombing raids over Germany, including the first 1000 bomber raid. It was known for its ability to sustain huge damage, yet remain in the air. The Wellington underwent various design modifications during the war, and a total of nearly 11,500 had been built by 1945. The Stirling was the first 4-engine bomber to enter combat service with the Royal Air Force. It made its debut in August 1940, but was never used with much effect until the start of 1942. 4 Bristol Hercules 16s provided the power which gave a top speed of 270 miles per hour, and its operational range was 2,300 miles. The Stirling's 8-man crew could fly the plane to a height of 17,000 feet. Protection was provided by a total of 8 0.303-inch machine guns, 2 positioned in the nose turret, 4 in the rear turret, and 2 in a small turret in the roof of the plane near the rear. The bomb-carrying capacity was 14,000 pounds. The Stirling plane was a purpose-built heavy bomber that had few flaws, although the relatively low operational height of the plane left it susceptible to flak batteries and roving night fighters. In addition, the bomb bay had a design fault and was restricted to carrying smaller bombs. There were a total of 1,630 bomber versions of the Stirling made before the war's end. The Avro Lancaster was the mainstay heavy bomber of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. It first saw service at the start of 1942. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engines could propel the aircraft to a top speed of 285 miles per hour. The ceiling height was 19,000 feet with a range of 1,730 miles, and it was under the control of a 7-man crew. The armament was provided by 8 0.303-inch machine guns. The gun layout was the same as the Stirling, with 2 guns in the nose, 4 in the tail, and the remaining 2 in the roof to the rear. The bomb load was up to 18,000 pounds. The Lancaster is without doubt one of the most famous aircraft that has ever flown. Its design had its roots in the earlier 2-engine bombers, but these needed modifications to allow a heavier bomb load and longer operational range. It was loved by its crews for its sturdiness, good handling, excellent gun layout, and large bomb load. There were over 7,300 examples of Lancasters built during the war. From its introduction in 1942 until the end of the war, the plane would be responsible for dropping over half of the total RAF bombs that fell on Germany. The Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress was first used during the mid-1930s in a coastal defense role. The power came from 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines that could give a speed of between 287 and 323 miles per hour. It was operated by a 9 or 10-man crew, could fly at 37,000 feet with a range of between 2,000 to 3,000 miles. The armament specification began with 8 machine guns of either the 0.3-inch or 0.5-inch type, but this increased to 11 machine guns on later versions. The bomb load was up to 17,600 pounds. The Flying Fortress was the main American bomber used during the Second World War. The early versions were used in daylight raids and quickly ran into difficulties against the fighters of the Luftwaffe, but later models increased the amount of weaponry on board to give good all-round protection. The B-17G is the most well-known version, and a total of 8,680 B-17s were made by the war's end. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was a widely used American bomber that first entered service in 1939. It was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, which produced a top speed of 300 miles per hour. It could fly up to 32,000 feet with a range of 2,850 miles. It required a 10-man crew. The armament was provided by 10 0.5-inch machine guns, and the bomb load was up to 12,800 pounds. The Liberator saw extensive service in a number of roles, including coastal defense, bomber, and trainer. There were almost 18,500 models made, more than any other bomber in history. Early bombing campaigns were haphazard and highly inaccurate. When Bomber Harris took control of Bomber Command at the start of 1942, he inherited and continued the policy of area bombing that would cause controversy and excite debate long after the war ended. To maximize the use of the growing bomber force, it was decided that the deliberate targeting of German civilians would seriously damage morale and inflict death and carnage on the industrial workers who were key to the German war effort. Harris strongly believed in this new concept and set about enforcing it with all his power. This type of bombing had not been carried out before on such a scale, and the moral implications were high. The plan was known only to key high-ranking personnel, with the air crews being told that the targets were of military importance. Area bombing would spell death for more than 600,000 German civilians. With the entry of America into the Second World War, the odds against Germany began to stack up. A policy of round-the-clock bombing was agreed, whereby the British would continue with nighttime attacks, while the Americans would bomb during the day. Initially, the British had pushed for combined night attacks, but the Americans remained convinced that night bombings were not the way forward. They believed that better accuracy could be achieved with daylight raids, and that their heavily armed planes could cope with the German fighters. They would soon learn that their trust was misplaced. One of the main operational changes introduced by Bomber Harris was the continuous bombing of a set number of key targets. This was in place of the previous wide dispersal of bombing raids that had proved so ineffective. Once the targets were agreed, combined Allied forces would bomb cities in rotation, often over a period of a few days. The phenomenon of firestorms would add a new and terrifying aspect to the horrors of modern warfare. Although cities would not be completely destroyed, the amount of death and destruction caused by the raging fires would be unprecedented. The first phase in this new tactic involved the dropping of larger, high-explosive 4,000 and 8,000 pound bombs, which were designed to create large craters. These would hamper the efforts of the emergency services when fighting the fires. These bombs would be followed up with smaller blast bombs that were designed to smash the windows of the buildings and punch holes in the roofs. The final phase was the dropping of the deadly incendiary bombs. These would start fires that would be assisted by the flow of air through the broken windows and damaged roofs. The spread of the fires would be rapid, as the targets chosen for this new tactic were the older cities with high numbers of wooden buildings. The result was a firestorm, which would spread rapidly and gain in intensity. Many people were killed by asphyxiation. As a final misery, time delay mines would then explode as the firefighting crews tried to contain the fires. This new terror would claim the lives of at least a third of all civilians killed in bombing raids over Germany. At the start of the Second World War, it was Britain who stood alone against Germany. Britain's course of action was determined by necessity, and an element of fate would bring about America's involvement. The situation facing the Allies was a grim one indeed. The forces of Hitler's Germany had encompassed vast areas of Europe, and by the time America entered the war, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. The Allies would face an uphill struggle in their attempts to gain the upper hand, and they entered the aerial war with no idea of how things would progress. The only common goal was their firm conviction to remain in the war and to fight the enemy in every way possible. They had very little idea of what the enemy possessed or what the enemy was capable of. But they would not have to wait long to discover the true potential of Hitler's forces. Forces that would exact a terrible price from Allied airmen. The bombing campaign over Germany would introduce a grim new dimension to the fighting during World War II. It was now total war, a new and savage era in which technology would lead the way as each side struggled for supremacy. The Allies had developed new weapons and devised new tactics as the war was taken to the very heart of the Reich. Now, the Germans were forced to respond in a desperate attempt to protect their vulnerable towns and cities. Like the rest of the major nations, Germany had experimented with various uses of aircraft prior to the First World War. When war finally broke out, Germany used the aeroplane principally in the role of observer and artillery spotter. They had not yet developed their own military planes, but they did have the use of huge airships that would soon be put to good use. The airships were under the control of the Military Aviation Service and would be used to bomb enemy territory. Owing to the fact that most early planes were slow, airships could outpace some enemy planes and operate at greater heights and ranges. As the war progressed, however, and the planes became faster and started to carry guns, airships became more vulnerable, and by 1917 they were virtually obsolete, as the Allies were shooting more and more of them down. It was the Germans who developed their first true bomber aircraft, and these joined the already expanding number of fighter planes. The German Army Air Service of World War I, as it became known, will always be remembered for one man, Baron von Richthofen, the infamous Red Baron. This most celebrated of air aces had 80 kills to his credit when ground fire claimed his life on April 21, 1918. The period after the First World War would see severe restrictions placed upon Germany by the victorious Allies. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden to have an air force, although this did not stop development of German aircraft, as manufacturers continued to make new types of planes, some of which were designed with military capabilities in mind. After Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the rearming of Germany began in earnest. At first, this was carried out in secret, But in 1935, the rearmament was made public. 1936 would see the fledgling Luftwaffe make its entry into the Spanish Civil War, which gave the Germans an excellent testing bed for their new aircraft and new ideas on the future conduct of warfare. By the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, the Luftwaffe would have a core element of experienced battle-trained pilots. The Luftwaffe was expanded rapidly in the years immediately before the outbreak of the Second World War, and by September 1939, it could boast a total of almost 3,000 planes. The Luftwaffe had developed some excellent tactics by the start of the war, and these would be put to expert use during the Blitzkrieg operations in Poland and the West. The Spanish Civil War had also highlighted weaknesses, which were urgently corrected. Although the higher echelons of the Luftwaffe command structure were far from ideal, there were a large number of very capable and competent people within its ranks, who would ensure that the Luftwaffe achieved stunning victories in the early years of the war. The weaknesses in the overall German air strategy only became evident as the war progressed, but by then it was too late. Although Germany made great attempts to counter the Allied aerial threat, the die was cast, and the Allies would finally overwhelm the Luftwaffe in a battle of numbers. Although the Luftwaffe was eventually defeated, their early victories remain a symbol of what can be achieved with complete cooperation between ground and air forces. They faced ever-increasing odds, both in the West and the East, and like their Allied counterparts, the pilots remained professional and steadfast, right to the end. Field Marshal Hermann Göring was a Bavarian who became a highly successful fighter pilot after arthritis made him unfit for infantry duties during World War I. The holder of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest imperial battle decoration, Göring was the last commander of 1st Fighter Wing, the famous Richthofen Squadron. After the war, Göring became a leading light in the new Nazi party, forming a close friendship with Adolf Hitler. Shot and wounded during the abortive beer hall putsch in Munich in November 1923, Göring nevertheless continued his prominence within the party and was made Prussian Minister of the Interior in Hitler's first cabinet of 1933. When Hitler announced the formation of the Luftwaffe in 1935, Göring was made its commander-in-chief. Göring was a big man with an even bigger ego, and his vanity would certainly contribute to his eventual downfall. None of this was evident, however, during the heady days of the Spanish Civil War and the invasion of Poland, which saw the Luftwaffe sweep all before it. It was only when faced with the determination and skill of the RAF during the Battle of Britain that the first cracks appeared in the Luftwaffe's seemingly invincible facade. Thereafter, the previously close relationship between Hitler and Göring became tense and strained. Confronted by the prospect of diminishing influence over the Führer, Göring began to make a series of unsustainable promises. No bombs, he vowed, would fall on Berlin, and the army at Stalingrad would be supplied from the air by the Luftwaffe. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and he became increasingly dependent on drugs. Gradually, Göring neglected his duties, and the Luftwaffe paid the price. After a telephone call to Hitler in April 1945, during which he indicated his willingness to act as the Führer's successor, Göring was arrested for treason, stripped of all his ranks, and expelled from the party. He surrendered to the Americans on the 8th of May and gave a spirited defense at the subsequent Nuremberg trials in October 1946. Convicted of war crimes and sentenced to hang, Göring committed suicide by cyanide poisoning on the 15th of October 1946. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Kamhuber served for the duration of World War I, ending the war with the rank of second lieutenant. During the interwar years, he served as a member of the Reichsheer where he trained in secret for the forbidden General Staff. After training as a pilot, he was one of a number of army officers that were transferred to the then still secret Luftwaffe in 1933. From then until the outbreak of the Second World War, he trained as a night fighter pilot, and by 1937 he was chief of the organizations branch. He was on active duty during the campaign in the West in 1940, when he was shot down and captured by the French. Fortunately, he was released after the French surrender. After his return to Germany, Colonel Kamhuber was placed in command of the night fighter arm of the Luftwaffe. The 1st Night Fighter Division was formed on the 20th of July 1940. The plane that was first used in this role was the Me-109, which was soon replaced by the Me-110. This plane remained the backbone of the night fighter units for the duration of the war. Kamhuber was responsible for a number of innovative measures during his command, which included the defensive system known as Himmelbelt. Under his command, the night fighters would take a heavy toll on the Allied bombing formations. However, disagreements with Goering saw him move to a command in Norway in 1943. His period of command coincided with some of Germany's most difficult times, and although Kamhuber did not bring about the defeat of the Allied bombing campaign, he did, on many occasions, force the Allied commanders to rethink and reassess their tactics. Colonel Hans-Josef Hayo Hermann was a bomber pilot during the early part of the war, and was responsible for sinking a dozen Allied ships, achievements which won him the Knight's Cross. He then transferred to the night fighting wing of the Luftwaffe and led an experimental unit, the JG-300. He constantly put forward new tactical ideas, chief among which was the wild boar strategy. Hermann later controlled the 9th Air Division and finished the war in command of the Ram Commando Elbe. He was, by this stage of the war, the holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 had been designed as a heavy fighter in the mid-1930s. The early versions were slow and proved vulnerable when pitted against the faster fighters of the RAF. But the plane would see a new lease of life when it was adapted for use as a night fighter. The Bf-110 was powered by various Daimler-Benz 600 series 12-cylinder engines, with the last versions using the DB605B type. This engine could take the Bf-110 to a speed of around 340 miles per hour and allow it to operate to a height between 30 and 35,000 feet. Its range was up to 800 miles, and it was crewed by 2 men. The armaments varied between 2 20mm cannon and 4 7.92mm machine guns facing forward, with one additional 7.92mm machine gun facing to the rear. Later versions were fitted with 2 30mm cannon and 2 20mm cannon facing forward. The Bf-110 would be the mainstay German night fighter during the war, with just over 6,000 being manufactured. The Junkers Ju-88 was designed as a high-speed bomber and, like its stablemate, the Bf-110, was designed during the mid-1930s. It underwent various design changes during its lifespan, with the Ju-88G being the type most used in the night fighting role. It was powered by 2 Junkers Umo 200 series engines, which would take the final versions up to speeds of almost 390 miles per hour. The ceiling height was over 32,000 feet, and it had a range of almost 1,400 miles. The 4-man crew had the use of 6 forward-facing 20mm cannon and 1 rear-facing 7.92mm machine gun. The Junkers Ju-88 was a highly successful aircraft that could be used in a variety of roles. As a consequence, more than 15,000 would be manufactured before the end of the war. The Krupp 8.8cm Flak 18 was better known as the 88, a weapon which would be heavily employed as the main defensive anti-aircraft weapon by the Germans. It was also highly successful when employed as an anti-tank gun. For air defense, the Flak 18 could fire a 20-pound shell up to a height of 26,000 feet, but it was not greatly accurate, and a crew had to be very experienced to score a direct hit on an aircraft travelling at that height. Its main function, therefore, was to damage aircraft and demoralize enemy air crews. Hundreds of these weapons would be employed in the defense of the Reich. They were used in conjunction with powerful searchlights that helped to illuminate enemy bombers. The Himmelbett radar system was a network of radar first employed in 1941 to detect and locate incoming enemy bombers. The first phase was the long-range Freya radar that had a range of around 150 miles. This was backed up with the shorter-range Würzburg-Riese that had a range of around 20 miles. The shorter-range radar could give height, speed, direction, and also the size of the incoming enemy formation. A second Würzburg then directed night fighters to intercept these enemy formations. Operated from a central station, the control system was a Seeberg table that used light points to represent each plane, a red light to indicate an enemy aircraft and a blue light to indicate a night fighter. The 160 separate radar stations were spread out over the entire area of France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, and northern Italy. The Himmelbett system was designed for defense in breadth and not in depth, and if the Allies managed to break through, they had almost free rein to deliver their deadly payload upon the cities and towns of Germany. A shortage of night fighters also hindered the Himmelbett system, preventing its better use. The Schlagermusik, or jazz music, consisted of a set of two cannon positioned in the roof of the night fighter in between the cockpit and the tail. These were angled at 45 degrees and faced forward. The weapon was not received well at first, but capable pilots used it to excellent effect, and its usage was increased. Taking advantage of the lack of armaments beneath an enemy aircraft, the night fighter would fly underneath an enemy bomber and fire a burst from the twin cannon, which would usually be aimed at its wings and fuel tanks. There were great dangers, however. Many night fighter aircraft were taken down with the enemy plane as it burst into flames. The Helle Nachtjagd, or night fighting by searchlight system, was introduced in 1940 as a measure against the increasing number of Allied air raids being conducted over Germany. It would prove to be the biggest threat to Allied bomber crews during the entire war, and more than 2,000 Allied planes were lost. The tactic was deadly. The radar system would detect the incoming enemy bombing formations, the belt of searchlights would illuminate the attacking bomber formations from below, and the night fighters would close in and begin to stalk their prey. They would pick an individual target and close in behind it before attacking it with their powerful cannon. The searchlight belts were positioned along the coast from Flensburg in northern Germany, across to Holland and the Belgian border, covering the Ruhr and Aachen region. The belt continued through Luxembourg and onto the eastern part of France near Nancy and Dijon. Another belt was situated further inland, covering the approaches to Berlin. It was Major Wolfgang Falk's successful experiment in the use of planes for nighttime fighting that saw the formation of the first night fighter unit. Night Fighter Group 1 came into being on July the 20th, 1940, shortly before Oberst Kammhuber's new Night Fighter Division, which operated under Kesselring's Luftflotte II. By the end of 1940, 3 separate night fighter groups had been established, all with a nominal strength of 200 aircraft, although the number available for operations was nearer 100. The majority was situated around major cities and the Ruhr industrial area. Others were sighted to cover the Eastern Front and areas such as the Ploisti oil fields. The wilde Sau, or wild boar tactic, was the idea of Major Hans-Joachim Hermann. He suggested the use of ordinary day fighters such as the Me-109 and FW-190 in the night fighter role, and after trials, this was introduced under the newly created JG-300 commanded by Hermann. The tactic was simple and would become a main feature of Germany's defensive battles in the latter stages of the war. The principle was similar to the Himmelbett system, in that use would be made of the searchlights in illuminating the enemy bomber formations. The planes under Hermann's control would then fly high above the bombers and attack at will, using visual identification methods only. This unit's success would see the formation of new wild boar units, and also an entire new fighter division that would have Hi-O Hermann at its head. This tactic was not always popular, however. Pilots were not trained for this type of operation, and single-engine fighters were not ideally suited to night fighting. Vernachtjagd, or long-range night fighting, was designed to take the fight to the enemy when they were at their most vulnerable, aiming to catch them when they were taking off at the start of their operations or to intercept them during their outward journey. Sometimes they would try to ambush them on the return journey to their home bases. The strategy had varying success and was never mounted on the scale of the night fighter attacks over the continent. It was difficult for the officials to confirm kills by the night fighters, and operations were officially suspended towards the end of 1941. The pilots, however, did continue to stage this type of operation and inflicted losses upon the Allied bomber crews. Mitschwimmen, or swimming with the flow, was a tactic used in response to the Allied bombers' increased numbers and condensed formations. The Luftwaffe fighters would fly into the stream of Allied bombers and travel with the formation. They would then pick off targets at will until they had expended their ammunition. In a role reversal of an unexpected kind, night fighters were used in conventional daylight raids or daylight sorties. Like the wild boar pilots, the night fighter pilots were being asked to fight in alien conditions, and the twin-engine planes were too slow to be fully effective during the day. Tactics that were deadly during the nighttime hours were almost suicidal when employed during the day, for lone fighters were easy targets for the heavily armed bombers. Daylight sorties were yet another attempt to counter the threat from Allied bomber formations, which would result in further losses for the Luftwaffe, losses that they could ill afford. The opening phases of the bombing offensive of World War II can be described as a policy of wait and see, for there are grave moral implications placed upon a country that decides to attack non-military targets belonging to the enemy. Britain and America had been developing their bomber forces in the years leading up to World War II, and were both of the firm conviction that if war broke out, the enemy would be capable of delivering a knockout blow from the air that would prevent any further prosecution of the war. The belief in the knockout blow theory meant that great efforts were made to produce an effective countermeasure. In the years leading up to 1939, Britain made huge advances in the development of early warning radar and a force of fast interceptor fighter planes. Priority was given to the development of fighters over bombers, and although this policy was unpopular in some circles, the benefits would soon become apparent. Hitler had stated that the Royal Air Force must be defeated before an invasion of England could begin. And during the summer months of 1940, the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe battled for control of the skies over southern England. Luftwaffe bombers attacked military targets such as airfields and radar stations, but difficulties were becoming apparent even at this early stage of the war. The fact was that accurate bombing of a target, even in daylight, was extremely hard. What was more, targets were not attacked often enough to render them permanently unusable. As the total defeat of the RAF became an unrealistic aim for the Luftwaffe, they switched tactics to concentrate on the bombing of London and other non-military targets. Even here, shortcomings were apparent, for the two-engine bombers lacked the range and load-carrying capabilities to deliver the decisive victory needed. Germany's inability to develop a long-range, four-engine bomber was proving extremely costly. While the bombs dropped on Britain's cities and ports, the Allies were making their own plans to take the air war to Germany. The bombing offensive over the Reich was begun by Britain's Royal Air Force, and in particular, Bomber Command. This force was built up slowly from 1936, and by the outbreak of the war in September 1939, Bomber Command had 53 squadrons available, although, like Germany, not all were operational. This would increase to 58 squadrons by 1941, and by March 1943, the total had grown to 62 squadrons. The number of aircraft available at the start of the war was a mere 300. This was clearly not enough for Bomber Command to prosecute an effective bombing campaign. Although the numbers available did increase, it was not until the advent of the heavy four-engine bombers that the effective campaigns could begin. By the spring of 1943, Bomber Command had more than 3,000 planes at its disposal, and the number would increase to nearly 7,000 by the end of the war. It would have the use of over 100 separate airfields, positioned mainly on the east coast of England and in the Midlands. Bomber Command saw several changes in leadership during its long campaign over Hitler's Reich. Men such as Edgar Ludlow Hewitt and Richard Pearce would be at its head during some very difficult periods for Britain. Charles Portal would also be in command for a brief time before moving into the higher echelons of strategic planning. It was Arthur Harris who commanded for the longest and probably most crucial period during the war. These men would help to shape the operational effectiveness of Bomber Command, transforming it from a small, ineffective group into a highly organized and focused killing machine. There is no doubt that Bomber Command, along with its American allies, played a significant part in the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany. America's contribution to the Allied bombing offensive started with the formation of the 8th Air Force in England during 1942. The seeds of the mighty 8th, as it became known, were actually sown in the year before. America was already assisting Britain in her war efforts from mid-1941, with military advisors stationed in the UK. The first American commanders arrived at RAF HQ in Britain at the start of 1942. By the middle of the year, the establishment of the new 8th Air Force was complete, with General Karl Spaatz at its head. The 8th was originally formed with the intention of supporting the operations in North Africa, but this plan was scrapped, and the 8th was moved to mainland European operations, where their B-17s and B-24s were seen as central to the attempt to take the war to the enemy. To achieve this fully, however, the 8th Air Force had to bring itself up to strength. An essential part of the plan was the construction of airfields in England. The location chosen for these bases was mainly in East Anglia, northeast of London. Existing RAF bases near Cambridge were used until new ones could be built, but by the end of the war, a total of 55 bases would be built for use by the 8th Air Force. The first units to arrive were the 97th, 301st and 92nd Bombardment Groups. Over the next 3 years, no fewer than 44 separate bomber groups would serve with the 8th Air Force in their operations over Europe. At its peak, a total of 41 bomber groups would serve at the same time. The amounts of aircraft available to the 8th increased slowly at first as the invasion of North Africa drew away reserves, but after this, aircraft became available at a much faster rate. By the early part of 1944, the 8th had 2,000 aircraft on hand. By late 1944, there were more than 3,000. It would eventually reach a number of 3,500, and their effective range from the bases in England could take them to Berlin and beyond if needed. As the air war escalated, it became clear that assaults would need to be mounted from places other than Britain in order to attack the southern reaches of the Reich. North Africa was considered, but abandoned once the Allies had gained a foothold in Italy, the perfect base for the newly formed US 15th Air Force, which was born on November 1, 1943. A total of 23 Italian bases were used during the war, the majority being constructed around the towns of Foggia and Cerignola. The 15th US Air Force was put under the command of Lieutenant James Doolittle, who was succeeded by General Nathan Twining. Consisting of more than 1,600 aircraft at its peak, the 15th attacked targets in Romania, Hungary, and southern areas of the Reich, raids which further stretched Germany's resources. Despite the unfriendly climate and the additional hazard of the Alps in northern Italy, the pilots of the 15th played their full part in the eventual Allied victory. It was in the early part of May 1940 that Britain delivered its first bombing attacks on Germany. These attacks were small but significant. They demonstrated Britain's willingness to forego any moral constraints and accept that civilians would be killed. At that stage of the war, no other country had taken such a step. Germany was quick to condemn the attacks and set out to deliver a response. The target chosen was the Dutch port of Rotterdam. The attack was ferocious and demonstrated the extent of Germany's bombing capabilities against a poorly defended target. The Luftwaffe continued its bombing campaign during the Battle of Britain, until finally Britain achieved victory over Hitler's air force. However, Britain's victory over the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940 merely allowed her to stay in the fight against Nazi Germany. The real difficulty lay in deciding what form that fight would take, for the loss of so much equipment during the disaster at Dunkirk and the losses suffered during the Battle of Britain severely limited Britain's offensive options. Churchill was keen to show that Britain still had fight left in her, and with the help of the Air Ministry, the fight back began. Even as Britain was fighting for her life in August 1940, Bomber Command sent a raid all the way to Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. Throughout 1940, there were tit-for-tat bombing raids by Britain and Germany on each other's home soil, while the Royal Air Force attacked areas other than Berlin, with the main target being Germany's oil supply. These attacks were widespread, but they were inaccurate and sporadic. Initially, Bomber Command had conducted the raids during daylight hours, but the losses were too high to allow this to continue. In some cases, the bomber formations lost up to half their number. The switch was made to nighttime attacks in an attempt to reduce the losses, but the Luftwaffe introduced its use of night fighters, who continued to inflict terrible losses upon the bomber formations. During 1940, there were no less than 3 changes in leadership at Bomber Command. Ludlow Hewitt was replaced by Portal in the early part of 1940. Portal was then promoted and replaced by Pears. These changes in command, along with the enforced change of targets, were a certain indication that things were not going too well for Britain in her attempts to bomb the enemy. 1941 saw further attempts by the British to improve their fortunes in the bombing campaign. In March, the target priority was switched once again, with more emphasis being placed on attacking German shipping installations and U-boat pens. This was an effort to try and curb the production of the U-boats and ships that were inflicting such terrible losses on the merchant ships bringing vital supplies to England. By the middle of 1941, German night fighters were becoming fully effective and were making their presence felt even more upon the bomber crews. The RAF was slowly beginning to select civilian targets more and more, as they failed to improve the accuracy of their raids. At the end of 1941, Pearce would oversee the biggest raid of the war so far, when 392 planes attacked Berlin. But owing to the poor overall results, and with no hope of improvement, the raids were scaled back. Around the same time, a report into the effectiveness of the raids so far was published. The Butt report concluded that the raids were too inaccurate and the cost to Bomber Command, both in crew and machines, was too high to justify their continuation. Britain was indeed entering her darkest period. At the end of 1941 and into 1942, the whole future of Bomber Command was under high-level discussion. The problem was that the British war effort, with its limited resources, was being stretched on all fronts. The one glimmer of hope was the entry of America into the war in December 1941. In the middle of February 1942, Bomber Command issued its highly controversial directive for the area bombing of the enemy homeland. It was decided that attacks would be made on selected, densely populated cities in an attempt to undermine the morale of the German home population. As the bombers still did not have the technology to deliver their bombs with greater accuracy, it was decided that this new tactic, area bombing, would be the most effective use of the bomber force. Other crucial decisions were made during 1942. One was the appointment in February of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris to replace Pearce. Encouraged by the introduction of new four-engine bombers with greater range and bomb-carrying capacity, Harris ruthlessly carried out Portal's area bombing directive. There was also the first use of combined Anglo-American raids on Germany, although there were some disagreements over the merits of nighttime and daytime raids. Despite the setbacks and enormous losses, Harris was determined to demonstrate the growing might of the RAF to the Germans. In May 1942, 1,000 bombers, a mixture of Lancasters, Wellingtons, Stirlings and Manchesters, took off with Cologne as their target. The 2,000 tons of explosives delivered that day caused widespread destruction and loss of life. Harris's message had been delivered with deadly clarity. Further raids were also carried out over Essen and Bremen. Despite these huge blows to the enemy, the cooperation with the Americans, the introduction of Pathfinder aircraft and the improvement of aircraft bomb sites, Allied losses continued to mount during 1942. In all, 1,400 aircraft were lost. Furthermore, the bomber offensive was placing a huge strain on the country's oil supplies, and although German High Command appeared to have been badly shaken by the bombing, civilian morale had not collapsed, and war production seemed unaffected. At the start of 1943, the Allied leaders held a conference in Casablanca where they agreed a number of decisive measures regarding the future conduct of the war. One was the decision to mount an intensive combined bomber offensive on Germany using the air forces of Britain and America. The region of the Ruhr received particular attention from the Allied bombers, and for a period of 4 months, this area was repeatedly attacked. These raids included the famous Dam Buster raids by Guy Gibson and 617 Squadron. As the attacks on the Ruhr were drawing to a close, a new intensified attack was about to be launched. The destruction of a whole city was now on the top of the Allied target list. To achieve this would mean the full weight of all Allied aircraft being used, and some new, innovative tactics would be needed to counter the threat of the German defences. On the night of the 24th of July, 1943, the RAF set off for the city of Hamburg, a town chosen for its high population, old, unstable buildings, and easily found location. To counter the defences, the Allies had devised Window, a series of metal strips capable of blinding the defensive radar of the Germans. This was dropped ahead of the main force, which left the way open to engage the target at will. The use of incendiaries was widespread, and the result was the creation of a new phenomenon that became known as a firestorm. These firestorms would claim the lives of as many people as conventional bombing during the raid. The Americans then attacked Hamburg during daylight hours on the 25th and 26th of July and added to the carnage below them. The RAF returned on the night of the 25th and then once more on the night of the 27th of July. A final attack came on the 29th of July. Each time, the fires were intensified and civilians suffered further horrendous losses. By the time the last Allied planes left the skies above Hamburg, over 50,000 German civilians were dead. A huge part of the city was left in ruins. 400,000 homes had been destroyed, transport systems left paralyzed, and over 700 factories obliterated. Around 70% of this once beautiful city was consigned to ashes. The Nazi capital of Berlin was targeted next, with the Allies sending sorties from August to the end of 1943. Harris was keen to continue his area bombing tactics, and with confidence boosted by the attacks on Hamburg, deeper penetration of Germany was made. The Americans were also selecting their own targets in 1943, with the town of Schweinfurt being chosen. Here, factories were located that produced ball bearings, an item vital in the use of most modern moving machinery. It was hoped to destroy the factories and bring the German war machine to a halt. These raids were carried out in the usual daylight fashion, with the inevitable attacks from the German fighters. Allied escort fighters were to accompany the bombers, but all did not go to plan. During the raids, the Americans lost 15% of the force sent to the target. Once again, the mounting losses to the Allies were causing grave concerns, and questions were being asked as to the benefits of the area bombing policy. Although the resources were increasing for the Allies, the countermeasures employed by the Germans were becoming more sophisticated and effective. "1944 did not begin well for the Allied bombing campaign. They were suffering continuous losses against the expert fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, and High Command were once again voicing their concerns. An attempt to destroy the German aircraft industry was made during the final week of February 1944 in what was called Big Week, and although the results were good, the cost was high, with over 220 planes being lost during the week-long attacks. The German fighters were becoming more numerous, and the flak defences were intensifying. The attacks on Berlin were recommenced late in 1943, but these operations over the German capital cost a further 500 bombers. In March 1944, the attention of Bomber Command was diverted away from the towns and cities of Germany and directed against the targets identified for the forthcoming Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of France. Harris was bitterly opposed to this change of direction, but he was personally overruled by Winston Churchill. Although prospects did not seem bright for the Allied bombing attempts in early 1944, things were starting to shift slowly in their favour. The leaders responsible for the conduct of the bombing operations were determined to defeat the enemy by sheer weight of numbers, and they were convinced that the time was near when they would be able to overwhelm the Germans and finally defeat them. The number of planes available for the bombing offensive was on the increase. Radio direction finding was now available to aid the accuracy of raids. More importantly, the use of long-range American escort fighters was becoming more frequent, with their drop tanks that allowed them to carry more fuel in order to remain over enemy territory for longer. Now, it was Germany that was being stretched in all directions. They were losing the fight in the expanses of Russia, and the Allied campaign in Italy was making noticeable progress. With the landings in the West almost inevitable, it was time to tighten the noose. The one thing vital to the conduct of a modern war is oil. The Allies identified that above all other things, lack of oil would bring the enemy war effort to a halt, and so a systematic campaign to destroy oil-producing plants, supply systems, and stockpiles began. The raids over the Reich were becoming heavier and heavier, and it was felt that the time was right to deliver another fire raid upon a German city. Darmstadt was to receive its death blow between the 11th and 19th of September 1944. The RAF went in first, using the tried and tested methods employed in Hamburg. In the first hour alone, conventional bombs killed over 10,000 civilians. The incendiary bombs came next, and the recorded temperature of the attack in the city exceeded that suffered by the residents of Hamburg. The result, however, was the same. Over 50% of the city was destroyed, and tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives. The attacks upon the infrastructure of the Reich were finally delivering the sort of results envisaged in the early stages of the war. All essential supplies, oil, water, road and rail network, were under severe pressure, and the combat capabilities of Hitler's Germany were being fatally undermined. The final year of the war saw no let-up in the Allied bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe employed increasingly desperate measures, but they were too little, too late. The jet fighters of the Luftwaffe did strike fear into the heart of the Allied bomber crews, but there were simply not enough of them to turn the tide of the war. The Allies decided to inflict another hell on earth upon the German civilians, and in February 1945, with Germany collapsing, the city of Dresden would see one of the most destructive and controversial raids of the war. From the 13th to the 15th of February 1945, more than 2,000 Allied bombers flew over Dresden and dropped their deadly cargo. Again, the firestorms were whipped up, and the city's civilians were consumed in a blazing inferno, which burnt for weeks. Dresden is situated in the eastern part of Germany, and the city was full of refugees fleeing the advance of the Red Army. The exact figure of those who lost their lives in this short but intensive raid will never be known. However, Most estimates agree that at least 135,000 people perished in the sea of flames. At the centre of the controversy surrounding the Dresden raid is the fact that the city was of no strategic military importance by this late stage of the war. Other German towns and cities were also bombed right until the end of the war. Places like Leipzig and Berlin were attacked, and in a token attack, Hitler's residence at Berchtesgaden was destroyed. In a stark contrast to the first raids, these final attacks were made with little or no enemy resistance. The belief before the start of the war was that the bomber alone could bring an enemy country to its knees. Some people even believed that the advent of the bomber aircraft would render the conventional types of land and sea warfare obsolete. As the war progressed, it was soon discovered that this belief was ill-founded. As the problems of mounting bombing missions over enemy territory became clear, the tactics and tools were adapted and redesigned to meet the needs of the planners. Consideration had to be given to the threat from the enemy defences, which were strong and well coordinated. It would only be during the last 12 months of World War II that the Allied bomber offensive became fully coordinated and focused on specific targets. By then, the German war effort was near breaking point, and intense aerial bombardment helped to push the Germans to eventual defeat. The Allies did not bring about the defeat of Nazi Germany using this aerial warfare alone, but the part played by strategic bombing in the destruction of the enemy's ability to wage war was significant. The losses to the German civilian population were put at over 1 million casualties. Of these, 600,000 were fatal, with 200,000 meeting their death during the firestorm attacks on the cities of Hamburg, Cologne, Darmstadt, and Dresden. It is estimated that around 1 million Germans were involved in manning the defences of the Reich during the war, a sizable portion of their available manpower. Of course, the cost to the Allies was also appalling. Between them, the bomber crews of Britain and America suffered deaths amounting to 115,000 personnel. The total number of bomber aircraft lost was almost 17,000. The air war over Germany firmly established the role of the strategic bomber in future wars, a role that was confirmed during the final weeks of the Second World War, when a single US bomber delivered the first atomic bomb upon the helpless Japanese civilians of Hiroshima. The advent of the atomic age was upon us.